The land before Israel geography of QAnon and the Levant before Israel emerged as a distinct cultural and political entity. The land that would bear its name was part of a larger geographical and cultural matrix, the Levant. This term, used by historians and archaeologists, refers to the eastern Mediterranean coastal corridor stretching from modern-day southern Turkey through Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and the Palestinian territories down into the Sinai Peninsula. Canaan, the biblical term most often associated with the pre-Israelite period, lay at the heart of this corridor, a narrow but strategically vital strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the arid expanses of the Arabian Desert. Topography. In natural divisions, the land's topography is remarkably varied for such a small area. For longitudinal zones define its structure, the coastal plain fertile but narrow in the north, widening in the south. It offered access to maritime trade but also exposure to seaborne invasions. The central hill country, rugged limestone, ridges that would later become the strongholds of early Israelite settlements. The Jordan Rift Valley, part of the Great Rift Valley system, home to the Jordan River and the lowest point on Earth, Dead Sea. The Eastern Plateau, today's Transjordan Highlands, offering grazing lands and trade routes to Mesopotamia. This compact yet diverse geography created microclimates from lush olive groves and vineyards in the Galilee to the arid Negev desert in the south. Such ecological diversity allowed for varied economies: fishing, farming, herding, and long-distance trade, all within a few days' travel. Strategic crossroads, Canaan's position was its blessing and its curse. Sat astride the land, bridge between Africa and Asia. It's the only viable overland route between the great river civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. This corridor, later called the Via Maris by the Romans, channeled armies, traders, and migrants through the Levant. For millennia, whoever controlled this narrow strip could influence the flow of goods, people, and ideas between continents. Earliest inhabitants and archaeological discoveries. Archaeological evidence places human presence in this region back to the lower Paleolithic period. Stone tools found at sites like Ubadia in the Jordan Valley date to nearly 1.4 million years ago, making it one of the earliest known hominin sites outside Africa. These finds, hand axes, flint scrapers, tell us that early humans used the Levantan corridor as a migration route out of Africa. Neolithic Revolution by around 10,000 BCE. Levant became one of the cradles of agriculture. Sites like Jericho, Tel Azultan, and Ain Ghazal in modern Jordan reveal some of the world's earliest permanent settlements. Jericho. Archaeologists unearthed a massive stone tower and wall dating to c. 8,000 BCE, structures that predate the Egyptian pyramids by millennia. The evidence suggests not only defensive needs but also complex social organization, capable of mobilizing labor. Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age between 4,500 and 3,000 BCE. The region witnessed a shift toward metallurgy, with copper tools supplementing stone implements. Villages grew into proto-urban centers. Excavations at sites like Megiddo and Byblos show early city planning, trade in luxury goods, and the emergence of craft specialization. Urbanization and Canaanite culture by the Middle Bronze Age 2150 BCE. Not was dotted with fortified city-states. Jericho, Hazor, Lachish, ruled by its own king or governor. These cities were connected by trade routes carrying tin and copper for bronze production, as well as luxury items like Egyptian faience, Mesopotamian cylinder seals, and Levantine timber. The Canaanites spoke a Northwest Semitic language, used an early form of alphabetic script, and practiced a polytheistic religion centered on deities such as El-Baal. And Ashir, influence of Egypt and Mesopotamia on the region, the land before Israel, was never isolated. It was shaped and often dominated by two great powers, Egypt to the southwest and the Mesopotamian empires to the northeast. Egyptian influence. Egypt's relationship with QAnon was as old as the pharaohs, as early as the early Bronze Age. Egyptian artifacts appear in Canaanite tombs, suggesting trade in grain, wine, and oil in exchange for Egyptian gold and manufactured goods. by the New Kingdom period c. 1552-1070 BCE, Egypt exerted direct political control over QAnon. Pharaohs like Thutmose III campaigned through the region, famously defeating a Canaanite coalition at the Battle of Megiddo around 1457 BCIA. Battle meticulously recorded on temple walls at Karnak, Egypt's control brought stability to trade routes, but also heavy taxation and military conscription. Administrative centers such as those found at Beth Shean show Egyptian-style architecture, hieroglyphic inscriptions, and imported pottery. Yet, Egyptian influence was not purely political. Religious motifs and artistic styles filtered into local culture, blending with Canaanite traditions. Mesopotamian influence, from the other direction, came the cultural and political pull of Mesopotamia's Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, while the Tigris-Euphrates heartland lay far to the northeast. Its influence reached the Levant via trade and occasional conquest. The Akkadian Empire, under Sargon C., 2334 to 2279 BCE, claimed control over parts of the Levant and Babylonian. Traders brought textiles, spices, and precious stones. By the late Bronze Age, diplomatic correspondence between Canaanite rulers and the pharaoh preserved in the Amarna letters was written in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the Near East. This fact alone speaks volumes about Mesopotamia's cultural reach. Even in periods of Egyptian political dominance, Mesopotamian myths, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, administrative practices, found their way into QAnon. The Levant, as a cultural synthesis, the pre-Israelite land was thus a place of fusion. From Egypt came monumental architecture, art styles, and centralized bureaucracy. From Mesopotamia came writing systems, legal concepts, and cosmological ideas. The Canaanites absorbed and adapted these influences, creating a distinct cultural, milieu cosmopolitan yet rooted in local traditions. This hybrid foundation would profoundly shape the peoples and polities that emerged later, including ancient Israel. By the end of the Late Bronze Age c. 1200 BCE, the world of the Canaanite city-states was under strain. International trade. Networks faltered, possibly due to a combination of drought, internal rebellion, and the mysterious incursions of the Sea Peoples. Egyptian power waned, and Mesopotamian empires were temporarily distracted by internal issues. Into this power vacuum stepped new groups among them. The Proto-Israelite highland settlers who would soon reshape the political and cultural map of the Levant. But before their rise, the land itself had already experienced millennia of human habitation, cross-cultural exchange, and strategic significance. Understanding this prehistory is essential.
Welcome to HoXLive History of Israel Part 2. Please subscribe for more videos like this. The Patriarchal era, as recounted in the Hebrew Bible's book of Genesis, stands at the intersection of faith, memory, and history. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, known collectively as the patriarchs, are more than religious figures. They are foundational archetypes whose lives form the bedrock of Israel's identity. Yet, unlike the later monarchic period, we lack direct archaeological records naming these individuals. Instead, historians must navigate a layered terrain, biblical tradition, comparative ancient Near Eastern texts, and the archaeological context of the early second millennium BCE. This period, whether seen through the lens of belief or critical historiography, is about origins of peoplehood, of a covenantal relationship with a deity, and of a claim to a specific land. Abraham's migration and covenant, the narrative begins with Abram. Later, renamed Abraham, a man called from Ur of the Chaldeans to journey toward a land that the God of Israel promised to his descendants, such as Urfa in modern Turkey. But either way, the migration reflects known patterns of Semitic pastoral movements during the early 2nd millennium BCE, the cultural world of Abraham if we place Abraham in the Middle Bronze Age, c. 2000-1700. BCE, the ancient Near East, was a patchwork of city-states, each ruled by kings under the shadow of greater empires like Babylon and Assyria. Amorite tribal migrations from the Syrian steppe into Mesopotamia and Canaan were common, and the biblical patriarchs bear striking similarities to these semi-nomadic pastoral leaders. The Mari tablets from the city of Mari on the Euphrates mention tribal chieftains. Long-range migrations and covenantal treaties parallels that echo in the biblical accounts. The covenant concept, the defining theological innovation of Abraham's story, is the Berit, or covenant. In Genesis, this is not merely a political treaty, but a divine promise. God will give Abraham numerous descendants and the land of Canaan in exchange for faithfulness. Archaeologists and historians note that this resembles ancient suzerainty treaties, where a great king pledged protection to a vassal in return for loyalty. In Abraham's case, the great king is God himself. Life in the land of Canaan. Upon arriving in Canaan, Abraham and his household become part of a mixed environment of settled agriculturalists and nomadic pastoralists. Archaeological surveys of the hill country in the Middle Bronze Age show small villages interspersed with open pasture, ideal for herding sheep and goats. Seasonal movement between grazing lands transhumance was standard practice. Relations with Canaanite polities. Genesis portrays Abraham interacting with local rulers Pharaoh in Egypt, Abimelech of Gerar, and the enigmatic Melchizedek, king of Salem, Jerusalem. These accounts, whether historically literal or not, reflect the political reality of the time, a mosaic of small city-states, each led by a king who controlled a fortified urban center and surrounding farmland. Alliances, hospitality agreements, and occasional disputes over wells or grazing rights were integral to survival. Isaac, the transitional patriarch Isaac, Abraham's son, is a quieter figure in the biblical narrative, but his story bridges to generations. His life illustrates continuity remaining in Canaan. Redigging his father's wells and also conflict, particularly with the Philistines. While the appearance of Philistines in Isaac's time is historically anachronistic if placed in the early 2nd millennium BCE, since they are usually associated with the 12th century BCE. Their presence in the narrative may reflect later editorial layers. Still, the motif of disputes over water rights is historically plausible. In an arid land, control of wells often determined political power. Jacob, the father of the tribes Jacob, later named Israel, is perhaps the most vividly drawn of the patriarchs. His story is one of rivalry, exile, and return, a narrative arc common in ancient hero tales. Jacob's flight to Haran in Mesopotamia mirrors the historical reality that kinship networks extended far beyond Canaan, linking families through marriage and trade. The 12 tribes. Jacob's 12 sons, born to Leah, Rachel, and their maidservants, become the eponymous ancestors of Israel's 12 tribes. From a historical perspective, this tribal schema may be a retrojectioner, later organization of Israelite clans mapped back onto a single ancestral family. Yet the tribal system itself reflects real patterns of settlement and identity in the highlands of Canaan during the Late Bronze to Early Iron Age transition. Religious practices and beliefs. The patriarchal narratives depict a religion in transition. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob build altars, make animal sacrifices, and experience direct, divine encounters through dreams or theophanies. They refer to God by titles such as El Shaddai, God Almighty, and El Elyon, God Most High, names that resonate with known Canaanite divine epithets. This suggests that early Israelite religion did not emerge in isolation, but developed within the shared West Semitic religious environment, gradually moving toward a distinctive monotheism. Archaeological and historical correlates, while direct archaeological proof of the patriarchs remains elusive. The broader setting of their stories aligns with known historical contexts, nomadic sedentary interactions, seasonal movement between highlands and lowlands documented in Middle Bronze Age Canaan, covenantal treaties found in Hittite and Mesopotamian sources, similar in form to Genesis covenants. Names and language. Personal names in Genesis match West. Semitic naming conventions of the 2nd millennium BCE. The absence of monumental inscriptions naming Abraham or Jacob is not surprising. Nomadic clans rarely leave such evidence, and much of the material culture would have been perishable. Legacy of the patriarchal era, regardless of one's position on historicity. The patriarchal narratives have exerted a profound influence. They define the Israelites as a people chosen by God, linked to a specific land, and bound by covenantal obligations. They establish themes exile and return, divine promise, moral testing that will recur throughout Israel's history. Moreover, they anchor Israel's identity in a lineage that transcends political states or empires, rooting it instead in family, faith, and a divine relationship. Between memory and monument, the patriarchal era stands as both history and memory, an era without monumental architecture or centralized kingship, yet monumental in its cultural and theological impact. The figures of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob symbolize a formative stage in which a small, migratory family in a contested land received a promise that would shape millennia of history. Understanding them in their ancient Near Eastern context does not diminish their significance. Rather, it reveals how their story emerges from and speaks to the enduring human experience of migration, faith, and identity. Welcome to HoXLive History of Israel Part 3. Please subscribe for more videos like this: the Exodus and Conquest, the story that defines a people. The Exodus is the defining narrative of Israel's origins, a story of liberation from slavery in Egypt, divine intervention, and a journey toward a promised homeland. More than any other event, it shapes Israel's religious identity and moral vision. Whether viewed as sacred history, collective memory, or a blend of historical kernels and theological artistry, the Exodus stands as a central pillar in Jewish tradition, echoed in Christian and Islamic scripture. But from a historian's perspective, the Exodus poses a challenge. The biblical account in Exodus, Numbers, and Joshua is detailed and dramatic, yet direct archaeological evidence for a large-scale migration of Israelites out of Egypt is lacking. What we do have is a mix of possible historical scenarios, ancient Egyptian records, and cultural memories that align with certain elements of the biblical story. Slavery in Egypt, context and debate. The Bible portrays the Israelites as enslaved under a pharaoh who did not know Joseph. The historical Joseph narrative places his rise to power in Egypt during a time when Semitic peoples were integrated into Egyptian society, a plausible scenario given the presence of Asiatic servants, laborers, and officials in Egyptian records from the Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate Period. Egypt's use of forced labor, Egyptian kings, especially during the New Kingdom c. 1550 to 1070 BCE, were notorious for using labor, essentially state-enforced servitude, to build cities, temples, and monumental works. Papyrus records and inscriptions mention groups of foreign laborers, including Semitic peoples working in brickmaking and construction. The biblical description of Israelites making bricks without straw finds an echo in these Egyptian texts, although they never name Israelites explicitly. The land of Goshen, the setting of Goshen in the eastern Nile Delta, aligns with archaeological evidence that this region was home to large communities of West Semitic immigrants, particularly during the Hyksos period c. 1650 to 1550 BCE. Even after the Hyksos were expelled, Semitic-speaking peoples continued to settle there, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes under compulsion. The Pharaoh of the Exodus the Bible does not name the Pharaoh who hardened his heart. Against Moses, scholars have proposed two broad chronological models. Early date 15th century BCE, based on 1 Kings 6-1, which places the Exodus about 480 years before Solomon's Temple c. 966 BCE, leading to a date around 1446 BCE, possibly during the reign of Amenhotep II. Late date 13th century BCE aligns with evidence of Semitic presence in Egypt and the mention of Israel in the Merneptah Stele c. 1208 BCE, which refers to a people called Israel already living in Canaan. The late date theory often points to Ramesses II as a candidate, especially since the Israelites are said to have built the city of Ramses. Moses, leader and lawgiver. The figure of Moses stands at the heart of the Exodus story, a prophet, liberator, and mediator between God and his people. Raised in Pharaoh's court, but identified with his Hebrew kin, Moses embodies the dual identity of an Israelite shaped within Egyptian culture. Historical parallels while there is no Egyptian record of Moses, the motif of a leader confronting a king, and demanding the release of a people has parallels in Near Eastern literature, where envoys negotiate the fate of captives or vassals. Moses' role as lawgiver also parallels Mesopotamian kings like Hammurabi, who received legal codes from the gods. The plagues and the Passover. The 10 plagues that precede the Exodus, water to blood frogs, gnats, flies, livestock, disease, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and the death of the firstborn, form a dramatic, theological confrontation between the God of Israel and the gods of Egypt. Some scholars have sought natural explanations. Nile flooding patterns affecting water quality, insect swarms triggered by climate shifts. disease outbreaks in livestock, and human sandstorms or volcanic ash-causing darkness, however. In the biblical narrative, the plagues are not random disasters. They are targeted acts demonstrating divine supremacy. The Passover ritual, marking doorposts with lamb's blood so that the angel of death passes over, becomes the central festival of Israel's identity, linking the historical deliverance with annual remembrance. The Exodus journey, the biblical account, describes a mass departure, crossing the Sea of Reeds Yam Suf, and wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. The Sea of Reeds may refer to marshlands in the eastern delta or a shallow Gulf of Suez crossing, rather than the deep Red Sea known today. Logistical considerations: a migration involving hundreds of thousands, as the Bible suggests, would leave archaeological traces, yet none have been found. This has led some historians to propose a small group Exodus theory, where a much smaller band of Semitic slaves escaped Egypt and later merged with other groups in Canaan. Their story magnified over generations into a national epic. The wilderness period, the 40-year wandering, is portrayed as both punishment for disobedience and a formative period of nation building. Key elements include manna and quail, divine provision in the desert, the tabernacle, a portable sanctuary, symbolizing God's presence, the law at Sinai, the Ten Commandments and covenantal stipulations. From a historical lens, this period reflects the challenges of tribal cohesion in a nomadic environment. The emphasis on covenant law suggests that communal identity was reinforced through shared rituals and moral codes. The conquest of Canaan, the book of Joshua, narrates a swift, divinely aided conquest, Jericho's walls falling, Ai's defeat, and the subjugation of major Canaanite cities. Archaeology, however, paints a more complex picture. Jericho excavations show the city was destroyed multiple times, but not all align with the biblical timeline. Ai, the site identified as Ai et Tel, was abandoned during the supposed conquest period. Hazor shows evidence of destruction in the late 13th century BCE, which could match biblical accounts. Some scholars favor a gradual infiltration model where highland pastoral groups slowly expanded into Canaan, assimilating or displacing city-state populations rather than a sudden military takeover. Historical theories, historians have proposed three main models for Israel's emergence in Canaan. Conquest model, based on a literal reading of Joshua. Peaceful infiltration model, Israelite tribes gradually settled and integrated. Peasant revolt model, discontented Canaanite peasants, inspired by Yahwistic faith, overthrew city-state rulers and formed a new identity. It is possible that elements of all three models played a role. Theological and cultural significance. Historically debated though it may be, the Exodus and Conquest serve as the foundational liberation story of Israel. God is portrayed as a redeemer of the oppressed. The covenant binds Israel not just to a land, but to moral obligations. The land of Canaan is framed as a divine inheritance, not mere political territory. The narrative would shape Israelite law, festivals, and ethical worldview for centuries, influencing later prophetic calls for justice and freedom. Conclusion: from bondage to nationhood, the Exodus and Conquest, whether seen as literal history a historical core wrapped in legend, or purely theological epic, mark the transformation of Israel from a scattered people into a covenant-bound nation. The memory of Egypt, the wilderness, and the taking of the land would be retold, reinterpreted, and reenacted across generations, embedding the belief that Israel's destiny was guided by the hand of God.
Tonight, we journey deep into the heart of ancient history. Part 4 of our epic series, The History of Israel. The torches are lit, the shadows grow long, and the voices of the past are calling. So, dim your lights, pour yourself a rich, warm cup of coffee, and settle in. If history sparks your imagination, join our growing community. Subscribe, tap the like button, and share this with fellow time travelers. Now, let us step together into the era of the Judges.
The era of the Judges, the land in turmoil, a nation without a king. Picture this: a sprawling land of hills, valleys, olive groves, and narrow stone paths winding between scattered villages. It is a place where ancient voices still echo, the voices of a people trying to forge a future out of the wilderness. This was Israel after Joshua, a time of great promise but deep uncertainty. The Israelites had entered the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey, rich with ancient history and mystery. Yet, instead of the strong, united kingdom they had hoped for, the tribes found themselves loosely bound together, like a patchwork quilt frayed at the edges. Each tribe guarded its own territory fiercely, proud of its ancestry and traditions. Yet, they lacked a single ruler to unite them. The dream of a king remained just that, a dream. The 12 tribes: Reuben, Simeon, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin were scattered across the land. Their settlements stretched from the coastal plains, where the Philistines dwelled, to the rolling hills of Judah and the forests of Naphtali. Without a central authority, the tribes acted almost independently, bound more by shared memory and faith than by any political system. This tribal confederation was fragile. Local elders and chieftains ruled their own people, but when danger loomed, they needed a leader, someone who could rally the tribes to stand as one. This leader was called a judger, divinely appointed deliverer, who rose in times of crisis to guide Israel through chaos. The cycle of darkness and deliverance life in Israel during this era followed a painful, almost predictable pattern, cycle that shaped the hearts and minds of the people. It began with disobedience. The Israelites, tempted by the gods of their neighbors, the Baals, Asherahs, and others, turned away from Yahweh. They forgot their covenant, adopting foreign customs, forsaking justice, and neglecting the laws handed down through Moses. As a consequence, their enemies, sensing weakness, would invade. The Philistines from the coast, the Midianites from the east, the Moabites from the south all pressed hard on the tribes. Fields were burned, homes destroyed, and the people were enslaved or scattered. In their despair, the Israelites would cry out to Yahweh, repentant and broken. In response, God raised up a judger, charismatic, often unlikely hero who would lead the people to victory and restore peace. Yet, this peace was fleeting. After the judge's death, the people would fall back into sin and the cycle would repeat. Deborah, the woman under the palm among the judges. Deborah shines like a beacon, a rare woman who wielded not only wisdom but also power. Imagine a quiet morning in ancient Israel. under a tall palm tree near the hill country, Deborah sat, hearing the disputes of her people. Her presence was commanding. Her voice carried the weight of divine authority. She was both prophetess and judge, a spiritual leader who communicated the will of God. Men and women alike came to her for guidance. But Israel's enemies were closing in. King Jabin of Hazor had oppressed the land for 20 years, and his general Sisera ruled with an iron fist. The Israelites lived in fear. One day, Deborah summoned Barak, a military commander known for his bravery. "The Lord commands you," she told him, "to gather 10,000 men from Naphtali and Zebulun and march to Mount Tabor. There, the Lord will deliver Sisera into your hands." Barak hesitated. "I will go only if you go with me," he said. Deborah agreed. Together, they led the army. The battle was fierce, but then the skies opened, and a violent storm flooded the battlefield. The chariots of Sisera's army bogged down in mud, becoming easy targets. As the enemy fled, Sisera ran to the tent of Jael, a woman who offered refuge. But Jael had her own courage and resolve. When Sisera slept, exhausted, she drove a tent peg through his temple. Deborah's victory song, sung afterward, is one of the oldest poems in the Bible, a celebration of courage, faith, and the deliverance of Israel. Gideon, the doubting hero. The story of Gideon begins in the fields, where a man tries to hide his fear. The Midianites were terrorizing Israel, sweeping through like locusts and destroying everything in their path. Farmers hid their grain in winter presses to keep it safe. Gideon, a farmer from the tribe of Manasseh, was threshing wheat secretly when an angel appeared. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior," the angel said. Gideon looked around. "If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders?" God's call to Gideon was both an invitation and a challenge. But Gideon was unsure. He asked for signs, miraculous tests involving dew and fleece to prove God's promise. Finally convinced, Gideon gathered an army. But God told him to reduce his troops first from 32,000 to 10,000, then to 300. The reason was clear: the victory would be God's, not man's. In the dead of night, Gideon's men surrounded the Midianite camp. They blew trumpets, broke jars, and shouted, creating panic. The enemy soldiers fled, turning on one another in confusion. Gideon's faith grew, but he was not without flaws. After the battle, he made an ephod, a religious garment that became an object of idolatry, illustrating the ongoing struggle to keep Israel faithful. Samson, strength and weakness. Samson's story reads like an epic legend. From birth, Samson was set apart. His mother was barren until an angel promised a son who would begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines. Samson was a Nazirite dedicated to God with strict vows, including never cutting his hair. His strength was legendary. He tore a lion apart with his bare hands and defeated armies with makeshift weapons. Yet, Samson was impulsive and headstrong. His love for Delilah led to his downfall. Delilah, bribed by the Philistines, coaxed Samson into revealing the secret of his strength. While he slept, she cut his hair. The Philistines captured him, blinded him, and put him in prison. But even in captivity, Samson's strength returned. In his final act, he pushed apart the pillars of the temple where the Philistines celebrated, collapsing the building and killing thousands, including himself. Samson's tragic life symbolized the struggle between human frailty and divine purpose. Daily life, faith, and social structure. The people of Israel in this era were farmers, shepherds, and craftsmen. Life was simple but harsh. Most families lived in small villages or scattered farms. Religion was woven into daily life, but worship was local and varied. Without a centralized temple, people built altars or worshipped at sacred sites. The tabernacle, a portable sanctuary built during the Exodus, still moved with the people but was not always accessible. Elders held authority in their clans, and disputes were settled in community gatherings. Women like Deborah and Jael proved that courage and wisdom knew no gender. Yet, the society was patriarchal, and family honor was paramount. The dawn of a new era. Why Israel needed a king. The stories of the judges reveal a nation struggling to find stability. While the judges were heroes, their leadership was temporary and often limited. The tribes often acted independently, and rivalries were common. As threats from powerful neighbors increased, many Israelites longed for a king to unite the people. This desire would lead to the anointing of Saul, Israel's first king, marking the end of the era of the judges and the beginning of the monarchy. Reflection. The era of the judges was a crucible of faith and identity for Israel. It was a time when ordinary people became extraordinary leaders, when faith was tested by hardship, and when the promise of a united nation remained just out of reach. The stories of Deborah, Gideon, and Samson remind us that leadership often arises from unlikely places, that courage and faith can overcome great odds, and that human weakness is part of every great story.
Chapter 5. The United Monarchy. The desert wind whipped across the crest of a rocky hill, swirling grains of sand into a haze, through which a young shepherd's silhouette emerged. His name was David, son of Jesse, heart pounding as he stepped forward to meet a giant. The clash of sling and stone echoed. A single heartbeat stretched into eternity. Goliath toppled, groaning. David's breath steamed in the cold air. Around him, the ragtag Israelite army fell silent, staring. In that moment, two worlds collided, the tribal past and the dawning monarchy. The fate of Israel's future trembled on David's shoulders, and Saul as crown, and through him, the promise of Solomon's golden temple. I from tribal confederation to united monarchy. 1. Saul, the first king imagined. The Israelites, once tribes bound loosely by shared ancestry, huddled in tribal camps under the constant threat of Philistine raids along the western lowlands. By around c. 1050 BCE, the tribes clamor for unity. The prophet Samuel, whose gray beard catches the torchlight as he gathers Israel, feels the weight of their petition. Give us a king to judge us like all the nations. Samuel's heart aches, but he lifts his chin and anoints Saul of Gibeah, a tall, handsome Benjamite, humbly obeying divine command. 1 Samuel 8:10. Here, the scene unfolds. Saul, broad shoulders, anxious eyes, stands before the people. Murmurs ripple through the crowd. Hope, fear, uncertainty. Saul's reign, c. 1050 to 1010 BCE, was a tumultuous mosaic of promise and faltering loyalty. He led early victories, daring raids against the Ammonites, his voice booming over the din of battle, distant drums of triumph. Yet his compromise, sparing the Amalekite king Agag and the best spoils, stings Samuel's soul. Obedience is better than sacrifice, 1 Samuel 15, and Israel's fragile experiment with monarchy begins to crack. 2. David. The shepherd King David's emergence transforms everything. The vivid scene on the battlefield, his stone colliding with Goliath's skull, sets him on a spiral from shepherd to fugitive to king. Picture the fugitive David, breathing hard in a cave near En-Gedi, torchlight dancing on sweat-slicked stone walls as his followers eat dry bread. The memory of Goliath's corpse lies in some distant valley, its gore remembered only in whispers. David wrestles with doubt, his men hungry, the Philistines calling for his head. Yet his courage, his charisma, shines brightest in darkness. At CC 1010 BCE, Saul falls in battle on Mount Gilboa, his body pierced by Philistine arrows. Israel mourns, and David mourns from fugitive to king of Judah. Then the entire Israel, by c. 1000 BCE, the capital shifts to Jerusalem, the city of David. There, on the ridge of Zion, David reviews the city. Limestone houses clustered on terraced slopes, olive groves scenting the air, the Jebusite stronghold still defiant. He names it City of Peace, Jerusalem, and sets in motion the plans for Israel's spiritual and political unity. 3. Solomon, the Golden Reign. David's final act, before he breathes his last, is to hand his dreams to Solomon, his youngest son. At c. 970 BCE, Solomon ascends. He is a boy crowned, adolescence wrapped in royal robes, crown too large for his head. Yet wisdom shines in his eyes, God's gift. The splendor of Solomon's reign unfolds with cinematic breadth. Traders from Ophir deliver gold and sandalwood. Queen of Sheba arrives, eyes wide at his throne, jewels aflare. She breathes, "The half was not told me." Solomon's song echoes across courts, the famous wisdom parables taking flight in the minds of scholars and storytellers alike. 1 Kings 10. Archaeologically, the grandiose building projects, Solomon's stables, the fortified cities of Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer reveal a centralized power and resources. 2. Temple construction. A sacred center 1. Historical and textual foundations. The first temple's conception is David's idea, but its realization is Solomon's. The biblical text is architectural detail: cedar from Lebanon, dressed stone, ornate carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and lotus flowers. 1 Kings 6-7. Solomon calls for Hiram, the Phoenician king, to send master craftsmen and cedars. Strong scent of cedar, distant humming of chisels craftsmen shaping beams, makes the air thick with devotion and ambition. Modern archaeology has yet to uncover the temple itself, but finds like the Temple Mount, large stones, and nearby pottery scatters support its presence on the platform atop Mount Moriah. Rabbinic tradition invokes King David's sackcloth Tears Solomon, song sung aloud in the dedication ceremony. Then the house was filled with a cloud, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord had filled the house. 1 Kings 8:10-11. The narrative scene. Solomon, aged but eager, stands surrounded by nobles and foreigners. The slow burn of sacrificial incense. A hush falls. He raises his voice in prayer. Water ticking in the background, footsteps of worshippers. Suspended between heaven and earth. 2. Significance and symbolism. The temple was more than rock and rafters. It was the heart of Israel, a singular place for sacrifice, prayer, and the Ark of the Covenant. Politically, it centralized worship and authority. Culturally, it defined a shared identity. Architecturally and ritually, the temple knitted together traditions from Canaanite, Phoenician, and nomadic roots. The perfected craftsmanship of Tyrian cedar, fused with Israelite spiritual vision, marked a consolidation of power and belief. 3. Political and cultural achievements 1. Administrative centralization. Solomon's regime is revolutionary. He establishes a bureaucracy. 12 district governors rotating per month to supply food for the royal household. 1 Kings 4. Taxation, conscription of labor, and diplomatic marriages, for example, Pharaoh's daughter, link Israel to regional powers. Administrative towns Megiddo, Gezer, Hazor stand like watchful sentinels across the land. Imagine the messenger runs at dawn from Gibeon to Jerusalem, clutching a sealed latte of olive oil, and barley news of peace treaties, scrolls with royal directives, delivering the pulse of a kingdom that beats in rhythm with the palace. 2. Cultural flourishing wisdom literature flourishes in this era. Proverbs, penned by Solomon or by sages at his court, sprinkled like pearls in the mind. Ecclesiastes ponders vanity. Song of Songs sings of passionate love. The arts are awash in creativity. Craftsmen carve ivory and inlay walls with gold. Poets recite in candlelit chambers. Minstrels sing of David's youth with cheeky laughter and melancholy. Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Foreign dignitaries bring rare spices and exotic animals. A vivid scene. A Mercurian merchant arranges jars of myrrh and frankincense beside Solomon's throne, their fragrance curling upward through the golden filigree. 3. Diplomacy and trade. Israel's geopolitical footprint expands. Through Solomon's alliances, most notably with Hiram of Tyre, cedar flows from Lebanon and gold from Ophir. Archaeological surveys show a surge in imported pottery and luxury items at sites like Hazor in Jerusalem from c. 1000 to 900 BCE. The Queen of Sheba's visit, whether in historical truth or height of legend, encapsulates this. A diplomat from across the Red Sea, her entourage shimmering, asking piercing questions. She tests wisdom with riddles. She laughs, nods impressed beyond expectation. 4. Causes, effects, and historical significance. Let us drill down into why the United Monarchy matters and why its memory resonates millennia later. 1. Causes. Why a united monarchy? External pressures. Philistines presented a common foe. Israel's fragmentation made it vulnerable. Spiritual longing. Prophetic traditions yearned for unity, even if monarchy risked contamination. Samuel's compromise is pregnant with tension. Charismatic leadership. Saul, David, Solomon each brought something unique. Saul's military posture, David's charisma and diplomacy, Solomon's wisdom and economic vision. 2. Effects, immediate and long-term. Cultural cohesion. The temple serves as a unifying symbol, giving Israel a singular religious center. Administrative foundation. Solomon's institutions laid a blueprint for future governance for both Israel and later Judah. Myth, memory, identity. Davidic lineage becomes the touchstone for later hope for return from exile, for messianic expectation. The idea of united monarchy enters sacred story and nationalist imagination. 3. Historical significance. Beyond Bible into archaeology. While skepticism once relegated these figures to myth, mounting evidence archaeological inscriptions, Tel Dan, city gates and granaries, suggests a real powerful polity existed. Debates endure. Were David and Solomon ruling titanic kingdoms, or localized territories enlarged by later imagination? But the archaeological trend sways toward recognizing their kernel of historicity. Consider this scene. An archaeologist in the Jerusalem offal brushes earth beside a stone arch dating to 10th century BCE, runs fingers through dust that once felt the tread of priests on pilgrimage. The boundaries between story and soil, myth and material, blur and history breathes again. V. The emotional currents and the cliffhanger. Saul's wasted promise, David's longing and grief for Absalom, Solomon's lonely grandeur emotions flow beneath the political surface. In Solomon's final years, the burden of building, the cost in lives and loyalty, creates unrest. The people's murmurs rise. Too much. The camera shifts to a foreboding horizon. Rehoboam prepares to succeed his father. His judgments will crack the united monarchy's fragile unity. You sense the approaching fracture. The warmth of prosperity cools. The stage is set for division. Reflective close. the United Monarchy, in its rise and radiance, stands as a pivotal chapter in Israel's long, arduous saga. It marks the transition from tribal tribes tethered loosely by covenant to a kingdom that defined a people as aspiration, spirituality, and political identity. Saul's troubled coronation, David's heartfelt poetry, Solomon's dazzling temple, they weave together in a tapestry both human and sacred. History remembers them not just for kingship, but for setting a stage on which later generations would project dreams of unity, wisdom, and divine favor. Archaeology and scripture together testify that this was not mere legend, but memory shaped by real stones, real voices, and real longings. As we close this chapter, the echo of hammer on stone fades, but the cracks already begin to appear. In the next chapter, the kingdom divides, north and south, faith splinters, prophets rise to speak against kings, and exile looms on the horizon. The tale of a people redefined by crisis begins. Hold your breath, for the storm of division gathers. Chapter 6. Division and Fall. History of Israel, the shattering of a kingdom. The scent of cedar lingered in the palace halls of Jerusalem. Not the sharp bite of freshly cut wood, but the warm, resinous perfume of beams that had stood for decades, polished by the hands of servants and kings. In the courtyards, the morning sun turned the golden plates of the temple into a blinding beacon. The people looked up and saw splendor. The priests saw the dwelling of their God. The politicians saw power. But beneath the gilded surfaces, the air was thick with unease. The merchants spoke of taxes that bled them dry. The elders whispered that the young king Rehoboam was not his father. The priests muttered about idolatry in high places. The sound of tension was not a shout, but a low hum, like the distant roll of thunder. The day Solomon died, Jerusalem was draped in grief and calculation. The funeral procession wound through streets, crowded with wailers, soldiers in bronze helmets, and foreign dignitaries. In the midst of mourning, eyes turned to Rehoboam, the new king, a man in his early 40s. But compared to Solomon's towering legend, he seemed untested, almost small. When the northern tribes came to Shechem to pledge allegiance, they brought a plea: lighten the load Solomon laid upon us, the taxes, the forced labor for his grand projects. Rehoboam consulted the elders, who advised mercy. But his younger counselors, eager for the taste of authority, urged him to answer with hardness. He stood before the assembly, his voice ringing in the open air. My father made your yoke heavy. I will make it heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. A silence followed, brittle and dangerous. Then a murmur, growing to a shout. What share do we have in David? To your tents, O Israel. By sunset, 10 tribes had broken away. The once mighty kingdom, united under Saul, David, and Solomon, lay split in two. The birth of 2 kingdoms, the break was clean but jagged. The kingdom of Israel, north. 10 tribes, fertile plains, the trade arteries of the Jezreel Valley, the ports of Dor and Akko. Its first capital was Shechem, later moved to Tirzah, and finally to Samaria. The kingdom of Judah, south. 2 tribes, a rugged hill country, smaller in wealth and population, but holding Jerusalem and the temple. Jeroboam, Israel's new king, understood the danger of divided worship. If his people traveled to Jerusalem for festivals, loyalty could shift back to the house of David. His solution was audacious. He set up golden calves at Bethel and Dan, proclaiming, Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up from Egypt. The choice drew the fury of the priests in Judah and the condemnation of prophets. But Jeroboam's concern was political survival, not theological purity. In the short term, it worked. In the long term, it planted seeds of disaster. 2 paths, 1 doom. The 2 kingdoms grew apart like estranged siblings, bound by blood, divided by ambition. Israel's wealth came from agriculture and trade, but it was a kingdom of fragile thrones. Over 2 centuries, it saw 9 dynasties and numerous assassinations. Assassins could rise to the throne by sword, but rarely held it long. Judah, smaller and poorer, had a steadier monarchy, tracing each king to the line of David. Its hill country fortresses gave it some natural defense, but it was no island. The currents of Near Eastern politics pulled both kingdoms into dangerous waters. The prophets became the moral conscience of both nations. Amos roared against injustice. They sell the righteous for silver, and the needy for a pair of sandals. Hosea, in the north, spoke of Israel as an unfaithful spouse, beloved yet faithless. In Judah, Isaiah warned that making alliances with Egypt against Assyria was like leaning on a broken reed. It would pierce the hand. The kings often listened politely, then went back to politics as usual. The Assyrians stormed to the northeast. The Assyrian Empire was rising like a dark tide. Their armies were disciplined, their iron weapons unmatched, and their cruelty legendary. Cities that resisted were flayed, impaled, or deported. The Assyrian way was not just conquest, but transformation. Replace populations, erase identities, fold territories into the empire. In the mid-8th century BCE, King Tiglath-Pileser III began reshaping the political map. Israel, under King Pekah, joined a coalition with Aram Damascus to resist Assyria. Judah's king Ahaz refused to join, prompting Israel and Aram to invade Judah in what became known as the Syro-Ephraimite War. Ahaz, instead of trusting the prophet Isaiah's call for faith, appealed to Assyria for help. It worked, for a price. Assyria crushed Israel's allies, annexed parts of its territory, and made Judah a vassal. The fall of Samaria, 722 BCE. Israel's final king, Hoshea, tried to rebel, betting on Egypt's aid. The gamble failed. In 725 BCE, Shalmaneser V laid siege to Samaria. For 3 years, the city held out. Food dwindled, disease spread, and desperation hung over the streets. When the walls finally fell in 722 BCE under Sargon II, the Assyrians deported tens of thousands, replacing them with settlers from other parts of the empire. The archaeological layers at Samaria show sudden destruction. Burned homes, shattered pottery, arrowheads in the rubble. The northern kingdom was gone. Its people, the so-called lost tribes, vanished from political history, though their descendants would survive in scattered communities. Judah watched in fear. The prophet's warnings were no longer abstract. The fate of the north loomed like a shadow. Judah under siege, King Hezekiah, a reformer, removed pagan shrines and centralized worship in the temple. But he also rebelled against Assyria. In 701 BCE, Sennacherib's armies swept through Judah, capturing 46 fortified cities. The siege of Lachish, vividly depicted in stone reliefs in Sennacherib's palace, shows battering rams, impaled prisoners, and deportations. Jerusalem braced for its own siege. The biblical account tells of a miraculous deliverance, an angel striking down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night. Assyrian records offer a different ending. Sennacherib boasted of shutting Hezekiah like a caged bird and receiving tribute. Whatever happened, Jerusalem survived, for the moment. The Babylonian advance. A century later, Assyria crumbled under attacks from the Medes and Babylonians. Nebuchadnezzar II emerged as the dominant power. In 605 BCE, he crushed Egypt at Carchemish, securing control over Judah. Jehoiakim, Judah's king, submitted but soon rebelled. Babylon returned with fire. In 597 BCE, Jerusalem fell. King Jehoiachin and thousands of elite citizens were taken into exile. Nebuchadnezzar placed Zedekiah on the throne as a puppet. The prophet Jeremiah walked the streets, urging submission to Babylon as the only path to survival. He was called a traitor. Zedekiah, swayed by false prophets and Egyptian promises, rebelled again. The final siege and destruction of the First Temple, 586 BCE. In 588 BCE, Babylonian armies returned. They encircled Jerusalem, cutting off supplies. For nearly 2 years, hunger hollowed the city. The Book of Lamentations spares no horror. Mothers boiling their own children for food, priests fainting from hunger, the streets littered with corpses. In the summer of 586 BCE, the walls were breached. Babylonian soldiers poured in, burning homes, slaughtering resistors. The temple, the pride of Solomon's reign, was set on fire. Gold melted from its walls and vessels, flowing like molten rivers. The Ark of the Covenant disappeared from history, perhaps hidden, perhaps destroyed. Zedekiah fled, but was captured. His sons were executed before his eyes. Then he was blinded and taken in chains to Babylon. Jerusalem's survivors were led away in long columns, their heads bowed under the sun. The division of the kingdom after Solomon's death weakened Israel and Judah beyond repair. Internal corruption, social inequality, and the lure of foreign alliances eroded their foundations. The prophets had warned that injustice and idolatry would lead to ruin, but the political elite saw only the next diplomatic maneuver. Assyria's conquest of Israel and Babylon's destruction of Judah were not just military events. They were the consequences of decades of political short-sightedness. Yet exile became the crucible in which Jewish identity was reforged, now centered not on a temple or a king, but on the covenant, the law, and the hope of restoration. As the smoke of the burning temple drifted eastward, the exiles trudged toward Babylon. Behind them, Jerusalem's walls were jagged black teeth against the sky. Ahead lay an alien land, strange tongues, and the bitter waters of captivity. Yet even in despair, songs were born. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. Empires believed they had erased a nation. But in the scrolls carried by priests, in the stories whispered by elders, in the stubborn memory of a covenant, a people endured. And though the stones of the temple lay in ruins, the dream of return was already taking root. Chapter 7. Return from Exile. History of Israel Persian. Rule and the rebuilding of the temple. Ezra and Nehemiah's. Reforms, cultural and religious revival. A dawn over ruins, the morning sun rose pale and hesitant over Jerusalem, spilling light over a city that was more memory than reality. From the Mount of Olives, one could look down and see the skeletal outlines of walls long fallen, the jagged stumps of gates, and the Temple Mount where the heart of Israel's faith had once pulsed with fire and song. In the still air, the wind carried only the faintest echo of what had been. The chanting of priests, the lowing of sacrificial cattle, the aroma of incense curling upward toward heaven. Now there was only stone and silence. Yet on this particular morning, a caravan was winding its way toward the city gates, or rather, toward the gap where those gates had once stood. Their robes were dust-stained, their faces weathered by long travel, but their eyes held something more precious than gold or weapons. The unshakable determination of returnees. 70 years had passed since Babylon's armies had carried their ancestors into exile, scattering them into the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates. Now, under the unexpected decree of a foreign king, they were coming home. In the crowd, a young boy clung to his father's cloak. He had never seen Jerusalem before. The stories had been his only guide. "Is this the place?" he whispered. His father, a man born in captivity, nodded with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Yes," he said, "this is Zion, our home." Main narrative. From Babylon to Judah. The fall of Babylon in 539 BCE was one of those moments in history that seemed to pivot the fate of nations with a single sweep. The conqueror was Cyrus II of Persia, known to later generations as Cyrus the Great. His armies entered Babylon not as destroyers, but as liberators. at least in the eyes of many subjected peoples. Where Babylon had exiled and humiliated, Persia sought loyalty through restoration. Cyrus's policy was revolutionary for its time. Allow displaced peoples to return to their homelands, rebuild their sanctuaries, and worship their own gods, so long as they paid tribute and remained loyal. For the Jewish exiles, this was nothing less than a miracle. The prophet Isaiah, writing decades earlier, had spoken of a coming anointed one, a Messiah who would free Israel. Astonishingly, Isaiah's words would be applied to Cyrus, a foreign monarch whom God had supposedly raised up for this very purpose. The Edict of Cyrus, recorded in the opening lines of the book of Ezra, was a lifeline thrown across the wilderness of exile. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem. Whoever among you belongs to his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem and Judah and build the house of the Lord. The first wave of returnees, numbering perhaps 40,000, was led by Sheshbazzar, a Judean prince of the Davidic line. They carried with them not only supplies and beasts of burden, but also the sacred vessels of the temple, gold and silver objects looted by Nebuchadnezzar decades earlier, now restored by the Persian treasury. The journey from Babylon to Jerusalem stretched some 900 miles, a slow crawl across rivers, mountains, and desert. At night, the exiles camped under the same stars that had shone over Abraham, their father in faith. The rebuilding of the temple, when the exiles finally reached Jerusalem, the sight was sobering. The city was a shell of itself. Grass and weeds sprouted where once there had been courtyards and markets. Wild animals prowled the ruined streets. The Temple Mount, that sacred hill where Solomon's glorious temple had stood, was nothing but an empty plateau of rubble. Yet the returnees wasted little time. Under the leadership of Zerubbabel, likely the same figure as Sheshbazzar in some records, and Joshua the high priest, they rebuilt the altar of burnt offerings. It was a small beginning, but symbolically immense. Before walls or houses, the people restored the place where they could offer sacrifices and call upon the name of the Lord. In 536 BCE, they laid the foundation of the new temple. The event was marked by both jubilation and grief. Ezra records that as the priests blew their trumpets and the Levites sang the Psalms of David, many of the older men who had seen Solomon's temple began to weep aloud. Their tears were not of joy, but of mourning for what had been lost, for the grandeur that could never be fully recaptured. But opposition soon arose. The local Samaritans, descendants of Israelites who had remained in the land after the Assyrian conquest, offered to help build the temple. When their offer was refused, the returnees insisting on purity of worship and lineage, resentment boiled over. Letters were sent to the Persian court, accusing the Jews of planning rebellion. Under political pressure, the rebuilding was halted for nearly 2 decades. It was only in the reign of Darius, the first, that the project resumed. Encouraged by the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, the people threw themselves into the work. In 516 BCE, exactly 70 years after the destruction, the Second Temple was completed and dedicated. While humbler than Solomon's, it restored the heart of Jewish worship. The sacrifices resumed, the festivals returned, and the covenant rituals found their home once more. Ezra and the revival of the law decades passed. The Persian Empire expanded and solidified its rule from Egypt to the Indus Valley. Judah, now a small province called Yehud, lived under the watchful eye of Persian governors. It was during this quiet but significant period that 2 remarkable figures emerged to shape the soul of post-exilic Judaism: Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra, a scribe skilled in the law of Moses, arrived in Jerusalem around 458 BCE with a fresh wave of exiles. His mission was not to build walls or altars, but to rebuild the very identity of the people. During the years in Babylon, much of Israel's cultural and religious memory had been preserved through careful study and copying of the Torah. Ezra's task was to re-anchor the returned community in that covenant. One scene in the book of Nehemiah captures the spirit of this revival with cinematic clarity. On a bright autumn morning, the people gathered in a square before the water gate. Ezra climbed onto a wooden platform, unrolled the scroll, and began to read the law aloud. As the words poured forth, the people stood in reverent silence. Many began to weep, struck by the realization of how far they had strayed from the commands of their God. Levites moved among the crowd, explaining the meaning of the text, ensuring that everyone, men, women, and children, understood. This was no mere religious ceremony. It was the reconstitution of a nation. In that moment, the people of Yehud were not just survivors of exile. They were the covenant people again. Ezra's reforms were strict. He confronted intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews, insisting that such unions threatened the purity of the community's faith. This policy, controversial then and now, underscored the deep anxieties of a small people surrounded by larger and often hostile cultures. Nehemiah, the wall builder. If Ezra was the restorer of the soul, Nehemiah was the builder of the body. Serving as cupbearer to King Artaxerxes I, Nehemiah enjoyed a position of rare trust in the Persian court. When news reached him that Jerusalem's walls were still in ruins decades after the temple's completion, he was deeply grieved. In ancient cities, walls were more than fortifications. They were the visible sign of security, dignity, and independence. Granted leave by the king, Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem in 445 BCE. He inspected the city by night, riding along the broken ramparts, noting every breach and heap of rubble. His plan was bold: to rebuild the walls in record time despite fierce opposition from neighboring governors like Sanballat of Samaria and Tobiah the Ammonite. The work was carried out with both tools and weapons in hand. One group laid stones, while another stood guard with spears and bows. Women and men, priests and merchants, goldsmiths and farmers, all labored side by side. Against all odds, the walls were completed in just 52 days. The dedication was a festival of triumph, with choirs marching atop the newly built ramparts, their voices echoing into the valleys. Nehemiah's governorship was marked by social reforms as well. He canceled debts, confronted corrupt officials, and ensured that the poor were not exploited. His leadership gave the small province a measure of stability and dignity in the vast Persian world. The birth of a new Judaism, the return from exile, was not simply a matter of going home. In many ways, the Jews who rebuilt Jerusalem were a new people. The trauma of the exile had stripped away illusions of invincibility. Never again would they take the covenant for granted. Under Persian rule, Judah was no longer a kingdom, but a religious community. Without a Davidic king, the high priest and the scribes became central figures. The law read, explained, and obeyed became the constitution of the nation. In this period, many scholars see the roots of what would later be called Judaism, a faith centered not on political sovereignty, but on the worship of one God through obedience to his Torah. The rebuilding of the temple gave the community a spiritual center, but the reading of the law gave them a cultural and moral spine. Ezra and Nehemiah's insistence on separation from surrounding peoples reflected a survival strategy. In the melting pot of the Persian Empire, where languages, gods, and customs mingled freely, maintaining distinctiveness was the key to not being absorbed and forgotten. A wall around the heart, the Persian period would eventually give way to the conquests of Alexander the Great and the storm of Hellenistic politics. But the legacy of the return from exile endured. The walls Nehemiah built could be breached in future centuries. The temple could be destroyed again. But the law, once written into the hearts of the people, could travel with them anywhere. On the last night of the dedication feast, Nehemiah walked the walls alone. Lantern light flickered on the freshly set stones. Below, the city lay quiet, its gates barred against the darkness. Above, the stars burned, the same stars that had shone over Abraham, over Moses, over the exiles returning with hope in their eyes. For all the fragility of human empires, there was something enduring here. A people who, having once lost everything, had learned how to rebuild not just their city, but their very soul. Chapter 8. Greek Influence and the Maccabean Revolt. History of Israel, the Temple in Shadow. The sound of bronze clashing against stone echoed through the narrow streets of Jerusalem. It was not the rattle of a battle, at least not yet, but the ceremonial march of foreign soldiers, their polished cuirasses gleaming like shards of the sun. The people stepped aside as they passed, staring in a mixture of awe and resentment. Up ahead, the sacred courts of the temple lay under a strange new banner. Blue and white pennants, marked with the thunderbolt of Zeus, flapped where the golden trumpets once caught the wind. The altar smelled not only of the familiar tang of burnt lamb, but also of something alien. A pungent aroma of roasted pig, its fat sizzling over flames that were never meant for it. A group of older priests, their linen robes streaked with dust, stood at the edge of the courtyard. They did not speak. They simply watched as a Greek official lifted a libation bowl high, offering wine not to the god of Abraham, but to Olympian Zeus. For the first time in living memory, the Temple of Jerusalem rang with the hymns of another people, in a tongue that spoke not of covenant, but of conquest. Somewhere in the hills beyond the city, men were sharpening blades, whispering oaths, and vowing that this humiliation would be washed away, with blood, if necessary. But before the revolt could blaze, the roots of this moment reached back to the march of a young Macedonian king who had dreamed of uniting the world. The arrival of Alexander the Great. When Alexander III of Macedon, barely in his 20s, rode into the Levant in 332 BCE, the world trembled in a way it had not since the days of Nebuchadnezzar. His army moved like a storm, phalanxes of spearmen in unbreakable squares, cavalry whose speed turned battles into routs, siege engineers who could tear down walls thought to be eternal. By the time his banners appeared in the distance, Judea had already heard the stories. Cities that resisted him were reduced to rubble. Those that submitted often found themselves favored and enriched. The high priests of Jerusalem weighed their options carefully. A delegation, robes immaculate, descended from the city to meet the young conqueror. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing centuries later, claimed that Alexander approached the temple not as a plunderer, but as a man in awe. In the story, he bowed to the high priest, saying that in a dream he had seen this very man before setting out on his campaign. Whether legend or fact, the result was that Judea surrendered without resistance, and was spared the fate of Tyre, whose ruins still smoked when Alexander's horse trod the stones of Jerusalem. Alexander left no occupying army in Judea. His genius was not in immediate subjugation, but in planting seeds. Greek garrisons settled in nearby cities. Greek coins, stamped with the image of Heracles, began to circulate in the markets. And perhaps most transformative of all, the Greek language, the coin, began to seep into trade, administration, and eventually even scripture. The slow flood of Hellenism, after Alexander's sudden death in 323 BCE, his vast empire fractured among his generals, the Diadochi. Judea fell into the tug-of-war between two powers, the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt and the Seleucid dynasty in Syria. Under the Ptolemies, 301 to 200 BCE, the Jewish people enjoyed relative autonomy. Greek influence came not through the sword, but through commerce, art, and architecture. By day, Jerusalem's main street was a marketplace of sounds and colors. Jewish merchants bargained over sacks of barley, while Greek traders shouted the prices of amphorae filled with olive oil. Perfume sellers filled the air with the smell of myrrh. Money changers' scales clicked as silver drachmas changed hands. Children darted between stalls, their laughter mingling with the neigh of pack animals. On the western edge of the city, wealthy Jewish families began sending their sons to gymnasia, not merely to train the body, but to learn rhetoric, philosophy, and the epics of Homer. There, boys wrestled on polished sand, discussed the nature of virtue with Greek instructors, and debated in a language foreign to their fathers' prayers. For some, this was intoxicating. The Greek vision of the human form, the symmetry of their temples, the rationalism of their philosophers, all felt like an irresistible wave of modernity. The Torah, ancient and unyielding, seemed to them provincial, an anchor in an age of swift ships. For others, it was a slow erosion of the covenant. The gymnasium's emphasis on athletic nudity clashed with the laws of modesty. The philosophical schools debated gods in the plural. The theater celebrated myths that blurred the line between the divine and the immoral. It was here, in this cultural friction, that the seeds of future conflict took root. The Seleucid grip tightens. In 200 BCE, Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire wrested Judea from Ptolemaic control. At first, his rule was pragmatic. He lowered taxes, respected the temple, and confirmed Jewish law. But the Seleucid court, a fusion of Persian pomp and Greek ambition, was a dangerous place for a small nation caught between loyalties. Antiochus III's son, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, inherited not his father's diplomacy, but his empire's instability. By 175 BCE, political tensions in Jerusalem had reached a breaking point. Rival high priests, Jason and Menelaus, vied for power, each promising the king greater tribute and deeper Hellenization in exchange for the position. Jason, urbane and fluent in Greek, went so far as to establish a gymnasium in Jerusalem itself, where young men, some even of priestly descent, trained in Greek fashion. This was not merely a cultural change. It was a public statement that Jerusalem was becoming a city like Antioch or Alexandria. For the traditionalists, this was betrayal. For Antiochus, it was an opportunity. He saw Judea not as a land with its own destiny, but as a rebellious province to be streamlined into the cultural mold of the empire. Desecration and despair, the crisis exploded in 167 BCE, whether provoked by a Jewish uprising or driven by his own zeal for control. Antiochus IV marched on Jerusalem. Soldiers stormed the temple, looting its treasures, the golden altar, the sacred vessels, the veil before the Holy of Holies. Then came the unthinkable. He dedicated the temple to Zeus Olympios. A pagan altar was erected upon the existing altar, and sacrifices of pigs, the very symbol of impurity in Jewish law, were offered in its courts. The scrolls of the Torah were seized and burned. Observance of the Sabbath, circumcision, and other covenantal practices were outlawed under penalty of death. Mothers who circumcised their children were executed, their infants killed before their eyes. In the streets, markets emptied, homes were shuttered. Priests who once sang psalms now hid in caves, whispering prayers into the dark. The city, once vibrant, lay under a suffocating silence. The spark of rebellion, the first open defiance, came not in Jerusalem, but in the rural hills of Modine. There, a priest named Mattathias was confronted by a royal official who demanded he offer a pagan sacrifice. When another Jew stepped forward to comply, Mattathias, in a burst of fury, struck him dead and killed the official as well. With his 5 sons, John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan, Mattathias fled into the hills. Others, hearing of his defiance, joined him. The rebels fought not as regular soldiers, but as guerrillas, striking Seleucid patrols in sudden ambushes, melting back into the wilderness. When Mattathias died in 166 BCE, leadership passed to his 3rd son, Judas, soon to be called Maccabeus the Hammer. Judas Maccabeus, the Hammer of Judea. Judas was no king, no general trained in the courts of the great powers, but he was a man of iron will. his faith a weapon sharper than any sword. His small force, poorly armed, often fasting, clothed in patched tunics, faced professional armies clad in bronze and iron. Yet battle after battle, the Maccabees triumphed. At Emmaus, they routed a Seleucid force, capturing weapons and armor. At Beth Horon, they used the steep terrain to trap their enemies in a deadly funnel. Judas moved his fighters like shadows, striking where least expected, disappearing before the counterblow could land. The Seleucid generals underestimated them, dismissing them as zealots. But zealots with a cause can be deadlier than mercenaries with pay. The cleansing of the temple. In 164 BCE, after a string of victories, Judas marched on Jerusalem. The city's defenders fled. The temple, abandoned by its occupiers, stood defiled. The Maccabees entered in solemn procession. They tore down the pagan altar, rebuilt the sacred one, and crafted new vessels for worship. Oil for the temple lamp, the menorah, was found, enough for just one day. Yet, according to tradition, it burned for 8 days until new oil could be prepared. This miracle became the foundation of Hanukkah, the festival of lights, celebrated to this day. The cleansing was not the end of the war. Seleucid forces would return, and Judas himself would fall in battle in 160 B, but it was a moment of rebirth, a statement that faith could survive the flames. The Hasmonean dynasty, Judas's brothers, carried on the struggle. By 142 BCE, Simon Maccabeus secured an agreement with the weakened Seleucids, granting Judea full political independence. The Hasmonean dynasty, named after the family's ancestor Hasmon, was born. Under the Hasmoneans, Judea expanded its borders, minted its own coins, and restored the temple's prominence. But power changed them. Later, Hasmonean rulers would become entangled in internal strife, even inviting Rome into their disputes. A choice whose consequences would echo into the time of Herod and beyond. Still, for a brief generation, the dream was real. A Jewish state, free from foreign overlords, born not from diplomacy, but from the grit of farmers turned warriors who refused to let their covenant be erased. The Maccabean Revolt was more than a clash of arms. It was a war for the soul of a people. Hellenism was not merely an occupying culture. It was a rival worldview. Where the Torah proclaimed one God, Greek religion offered a pantheon. Where Jewish law bound a community in shared rituals, Greek culture prized the autonomy of the individual. The tension between assimilation and identity, between modernity and tradition, is not confined to the ancient world. The story of the Maccabees resonates because it speaks to the human struggle to balance adaptation with preservation, to live in the world without losing oneself to it. When the menorah's flames first flickered in the cleansed temple, their light fell not just on stone and gold, but on the faces of those who had risked everything to see it burn again. Outside, the world was still dangerous, the empires still restless. But for a moment, in the heart of Jerusalem, there was warmth against the cold, light against the dark, and the knowledge that some fires, once kindled, can never be extinguished.
Chapter 9: Roman Rule and the Life of Jesus. The night air in Jerusalem was heavy with the smoke of oil lamps and the restless murmur of thousands gathered for Passover. Roman soldiers in bronze helmets stood on the city's walls, their spears catching, the flicker of torchlight, eyes sweeping over the teeming crowds below. Pilgrims from Galilee, Judea, and beyond pressed into the temple courts, their voices rising in prayer and song, but also in whispers of discontent. The streets pulsed with expectation and fear. Rome's banners fluttered over a city that was not its own, and every heart knew how fragile peace could be under Caesar's shadow. It was into this charged atmosphere, a land crushed beneath, imperial rule yet alive with hope for deliverance, that a Galilean teacher entered the stage of history. His words would stir fishermen and tax collectors, heal the broken, anger priests, and rattle governors. And though his life was brief, lived under the grinding heel of Roman authority, It would alter the destiny not just of Israel, but of the entire world. To understand the life of Jesus is to understand it against the backdrop of empire, the clash between the ambitions of Rome and the yearnings of a people who longed for God's kingdom. This is the story of how one man's journey unfolded within the iron grip of Roman power, and how his death would reveal not the triumph of empire, but the fragile and surprising strength of faith. Roman shadows over Judea. By the 1st century BCE, the Roman Republic had transformed itself into an empire, extending its dominion across the Mediterranean. Judea, a small fractious province, was not conquered with armies so much as absorbed through politics and intrigue. Pompey the Great entered Jerusalem in 63 BCE, and though Rome allowed a measure of self-rule through local kings and priests, the ultimate power now rested in the hands of Caesar. Herod the Great, the king Rome installed, ruled with a mixture of brilliance and brutality. He rebuilt Jerusalem's temple into a structure of such magnificence that pilgrims spoke of it as one of the wonders of the world. Its gleaming white stone and golden crown dazzled under the desert sun. But Herod's reign was also drenched. Blood. Rival claimants, rebellious priests, even members of his own family fell to his paranoia and cruelty. He was Rome's man in Judea, a king without true independence, whose throne was secured by the empire's favor and threatened by the people's distrust. When Herod died in 4 BCE, Rome divided his kingdom among his sons. Archelaus ruled Judea, with such incompetence and tyranny that Caesar Augustus soon replaced him with Roman governors, or prefects, stationed in Caesarea by the sea. Among them would rise Pontius Pilate, remembered not for his administrative skill, but for one moment in Jerusalem that forever etched his name into the annals of history. The Jewish people lived in constant tension. They were allowed to practice their religion, but Rome taxed them heavily, stationed foreign troops in their cities, and intruded on their sacred spaces. Zealots whispered of revolt. Pharisees debated the law to preserve identity. Sadducees cooperated with Rome to maintain influence, and ordinary peasants simply struggled to survive. This was the world Jesus was born into, a land simmering with unrest, divided within and pressed from above by imperial might. The birth of a child under empire. The Gospels tell of a birth in Bethlehem during a census ordered by Caesar Augustus. Whether Luke's account reflects a literal registration or a symbolic reminder that Rome's hand reached into every household, the image is clear. Jesus was born into a world where even the timing of one's life was subject to imperial decree. Bethlehem, a quiet Judean town, gave little hint of grandeur. The night would have been cold, the air sharp with the smell of sheepfolds and smoke from cooking fires. Into such humble surroundings came a child whose parents, Mary and Joseph, were ordinary people of Galilee, subjects of Rome, unremarkable in every way except for the destiny their son would carry. Herod the Great, nearing the end of his life, ruled from Jerusalem in suspicion and fear. Matthew's Gospel remembers him ordering the slaughter of children, an echo of Pharaoh's ancient cruelty in Egypt. Whether this massacre occurred or reflects the broader reality of Herod's paranoia, the message stands. Jesus' very existence was set against the brutal backdrop of power and violence. From the first breath, Rome's shadow loomed over him. Galilee, the world of Jesus' youth. Nazareth, where Jesus grew, was a modest hill town in Galilee, far from the splendor of Jerusalem, but not immune to Rome's presence. The fields and vineyards around Nazareth were cultivated by peasants who labored under heavy taxation. Farmers lost their land to debt, day laborers scrambled for wages, and artisans like Joseph, perhaps a carpenter or builder, found work in the expanding Roman Mina. Cities nearby, such as Sepphoris, Galilee, was fertile ground for both discontent and vision. Roman culture seeped in through cities with theaters and forums, while Jewish villages clung fiercely to tradition. It was here, among the poor and the devout, that Jesus absorbed the rhythms of Torah, the stories of Israel's deliverance, and the bitterness of living under foreign dominion. By the time he began his public life, Galilee had already witnessed uprisings crushed by Roman legions. The hills carried memories of crucified rebels left to rot along the roadside as warnings. The people longed for a Messiah, not an abstract savior, but a leader who would free them from Rome's grip. The ministry begins when Jesus appeared by the Jordan River to be baptized by John. The scene was more than spiritual ritual. John thundered against corruption and proclaimed the coming of God's reign, a dangerous message in a land where Rome claimed ultimate authority. Crowds gathered not merely for cleansing, but for hope. From the waters, Jesus emerged with a sense of divine calling, retreating into the wilderness before returning to Galilee with a message that electrified his hearers. The kingdom of God is at hand. To fishermen casting nets on the Sea of Galilee, his words carried both promise and danger. To proclaim a new kingdom was to imply that Caesar's was temporary, perhaps illegitimate. Yet Jesus' kingdom was not announced with swords, but with healings, parables, and meals shared with outcasts. He touched lepers, sat with tax collectors, and spoke of love for enemies, a radical ethic in a land where hatred of Rome was a survival instinct. His popularity grew. Villages buzzed with tales of miracles, and crowds pressed close to hear him. But with popularity came suspicion. Pharisees questioned his authority, priests worried about disorder, and Rome, ever watchful, took note of anyone who could stir the masses. Jerusalem. The clash of kingdoms Passover drew Jews from across the empire to Jerusalem. The city swelled with pilgrims, its narrow streets choked with traders, animals, and worshippers. For Rome, the festival was both a logistical nightmare and a political powder keg. Memories of Israel's liberation from Egypt infused the air with expectation of freedom. The slightest spark could ignite rebellion. Into this storm, Jesus rode, not on a war horse, but on a donkey. The crowd laid palm branches and shouted, "Hosanna!" a plea for salvation. The act was more than quaint symbolism. It was a deliberate parody of Roman triumphal processions, where victorious generals paraded in glory. Jesus entered as a humble king, challenging the very definition of power. Inside the temple courts, he overturned tables of money changers and drove out merchants. The temple was not merely a place of worship. It was the economic and political heart of Jewish life, tightly controlled by priestly elites who collaborated with Rome. By disrupting its commerce, Jesus struck at both religious corruption and imperial order. The authorities could not ignore him. Trial and crucifixion. The final week unfolded with rising tension. Jesus taught in the temple by day, debated opponents, and withdrew to pray by night. His parables grew sharper, his warnings against hypocrisy more biting. The priests saw him as a threat to stability. The Romans feared unrest. When he was arrested at night, betrayed by one of his own, it was not merely a religious matter. The charge was political, claiming kingship, challenging Caesar's authority. Before Pilate, the Roman governor, Jesus stood silent as accusations flew. Pilate, uneasy, found no fault yet feared the crowd. To keep peace, he washed his hands, a gesture of evasion, and handed the Galilean over to the soldiers. Crucifixion was Rome's ultimate symbol of dominance, reserved for slaves and rebels. It was meant not only to kill but to humiliate and terrorize. Jesus was stripped, flogged, crowned with thorns, and paraded through the streets. On Golgotha, outside the city walls, he was nailed to wood and left to die in the scorching sun. The inscription above him read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." Rome intended it as mockery, yet for his followers it became a proclamation. Aftermath, the empire and the movement. From Rome's perspective, the crucifixion of one Galilean teacher was a minor event. Countless rebels had met the same fate. But within days, whispers spread of an empty tomb, of disciples who claimed to have seen him alive. Whether one views these accounts as faith or history, their effect is undeniable. A movement that Rome sought to extinguish grew instead into a fire that would one day engulf the empire itself. The earliest followers of Jesus proclaimed him not merely a teacher, but the Messiah risen from the dead. They gathered in homes, shared meals, and defied fear. Their message was radical, that God's kingdom was breaking into the world, not through legions or kings, but through forgiveness, community, and love. Rome responded with suspicion, sometimes with violence. Yet the movement endured, spreading from Jerusalem to Antioch, from Galilee to Greece, until it reached even the heart of Rome. The empire that crucified Jesus would, within 3 centuries, adopt his name as its own. Why did Jesus' life matter so profoundly in the context of Roman rule? Partly because his message addressed the deepest wound of his people, the longing for liberation. Yet unlike zealots who took up arms, Jesus redefined the struggle. His kingdom was not a revolt in the conventional sense, but a revolution of values. Rome wielded power through fear and violence. Jesus offered power through service and sacrifice. Still, his story cannot be detached from politics. His crucifixion was not simply a religious execution, but a statement of imperial authority. It shows how empires respond to perceived threats with overwhelming force. And it reveals how fragile that force can be when confronted with ideas that outlive their enforcers. For Israel, the life of Jesus both fulfilled and complicated the story of identity. Some saw him as Messiah. Others rejected him as a false claimant. The division would shape Jewish-Christian relations for centuries. For the wider world, his life became a lens through which the nature of empire, justice, and hope could be reimagined. On a hill outside Jerusalem, Rome declared its supremacy by nailing a man to a cross. Yet from that moment of defeat came a story that has outlasted every empire, every Caesar, every throne of power. To tell the history of Israel under Rome is to tell also the story of one Galilean who lived, taught, and died within its grasp, and whose life continues to echo far, beyond the reach of Roman rule.
Chapter 10. After the temple, the streets of Jerusalem lay silent, but not with peace. Drifted like snow, settling on the blackened stones where the temple had once stood. The sanctuary that had pulsed at the heart of Jewish life for centuries was gone, reduced to rubble and memory. Roman standards fluttered above the ruins, a cruel reminder that the empire's power was absolute. For those who walked among the smoldering ruins, the air carried not only the stench of fire, but the heavy scent of loss, the loss of a center, of certainty, of God's house on earth. Some survivors knelt, pressing their foreheads against the still warm stones, whispering psalms through cracked lips. Others turned away in disbelief, eyes hollow. Children asked their mothers why the priests no longer sang, why the altar was silent. In that silence, an old world died, and from it, another was about to be born, one shaped by exile, defiance, and reinvention. The destruction of the temple in 70 CE had left a wound. But history is not merely about wounds, it is about the responses to them. Within decades, this shattered community would face another catastrophe. The Bar Kokhba revolted then. From the ruins of war and dispersion would fashion something enduring, a new way of being Jewish, without the temple, without sovereignty, without Jerusalem. The Bar Kokhba revolt, the Roman world was vast, but beneath its marble surface, discontent smoldered like an underground fire. For Jews, the years after the temple's fall were not a time of quiet submission, but of restless hope. Stories circulated of deliverance, of a Messiah who would rise to restore what Rome had stolen. It was during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, in the 2nd century CE, that these hopes crystallized around one man, Simon Bar Kokhba, whom supporters hailed as Bar Kokhba, son of the star. To his followers, he was not merely a military leader, but a divinely chosen redeemer, a Messiah in flesh and blood. Rabbi Akiva, one of the most revered scholars of his age, proclaimed him the fulfillment of prophecy, declaring that the star foretold in the book of Numbers had finally risen. Kokhba was no dreamer. He was a warrior of steel and will. He drilled his men with merciless discipline, demanding that they demonstrate their readiness by mutilating their own fingers as proof of obedience. His army, numbering perhaps hundreds of thousands, was forged in secret, a shadow force waiting for its moment. The spark came in 132 CE, when Hadrian, whose empire prided itself on cultural uniformity, announced plans to rebuild Jerusalem not as a Jewish city, but as a Roman colony named Aelia Capitolina. On the temple to Injury, on the Temple Mount itself, he proposed to erect a shrine to Jupiter. For Jews, this was not mere provocation. It was desecration. The land of David and Solomon was to be stamped with foreign gods. The revolt ignited like dry tinder. Villages across Judea rose in arms. Roman garrisons, taken by surprise, fell quickly. Jewish rebels cut roads, seized fortresses, and for a brief, shining moment, Judea tasted freedom again. Coins were minted bearing the legend for the freedom of Israel, as if proclaiming to the world that sovereignty had been reborn. The countryside hummed with the sounds of war, the clashing of iron, the pounding of hammers and makeshift forges. The whisper of messianic songs carried on the wind. In caves carved into cliffs, families huddled, storing grain, wine, and weapons. While soldiers moved through tunnels invisible to Roman eyes, it was a war fought not just on open fields but underground, in the very bones of the land. But Rome was not an empire easily mocked. Hadrian summoned his greatest general, Julius Severus, from faraway Britain. Legion after legion marched into Judea, perhaps 12 in total, bearing the weight of the empire's fury. The fighting was brutal, a war of annihilation. Roman legions scorched fields, leveled towns, and hunted rebels through valleys and caves. The land itself became a graveyard. Bar Kokhba fought with ferocity, but even his iron will could not withstand Rome's relentless machine. By 135 CE, the revolt lay in ashes. At Bether, his last stronghold, Bar Kokhba fell, killed in battle, or perhaps betrayed. His followers were slaughtered. Rabbi Akiva, who had once called him Messiah, was captured and executed with unspeakable cruelty. When the dust settled, the devastation was staggering. Cassius Dio, the Roman historian, claimed that over 500,000 Jews were killed. Judea was depopulated, its fields desolate. Survivors were sold into slavery, scattered across the empire like seeds cast by a bitter wind. Expulsion and dispersion after Bar Kokhba's fall, Hadrian sought not only to crush the revolt, but to erase Judea itself. The name of the province was changed to Syria Palestina, a deliberate attempt to sever Jewish ties to the land. Jerusalem was barred to Jews. Only on the day of Tisha B'Av, the anniversary of the temple's destruction, were they permitted to enter and weep at its ruins. Exile, once a punishment, now became a permanent condition. Families trudged along dusty roads toward ports where slave ships waited. Children were torn from parents, households scattered across the empire from the markets of Rome to the towns of North Africa, from the banks of the Tigris to the valleys of Spain. Yet exile did not mean disappearance. In foreign cities, Jewish communities reconstituted themselves with stubborn resilience. They built synagogues, their walls adorned not with sacrifice, but with word Torah, scrolls, prayers, songs. In Babylon, scholars gathered to debate law and tradition. In Alexandria, Jews mingled Hebrew memory with Greek philosophy. In Rome, they carved menorahs on catacomb walls, affirming identity even in death. The diaspora was not chosen, but it became a defining feature of Jewish history. No longer tied solely to one land, the people carried their homeland within them, portable, indestructible, written into their prayers. Each meal began with a blessing that echoed Jerusalem. Each Sabbath ended with a prayer for restoration. And though scattered, they remained bound by invisible threads of faith, memory, and hope. The transformation of Jewish life, Rabbinic Judaism, the temple, had been the axis of Jewish life. Its priests, sacrifices, and rituals had defined the rhythm of days and seasons. With its destruction, one might have expected the faith to collapse, as had so many cults when their sanctuaries were destroyed. But Judaism proved unique. It reinvented itself. In the ashes of Jerusalem, leadership shifted from priests to scholars, the rabbis. These were men steeped in scripture, versed in law, skilled in debate. They carried within them not incense and blood, but words and interpretation. At Yavna, and later in Galilee, they gathered to reconstruct a shattered world. They asked, how could one worship without sacrifice? How could one atone without an altar? The answers they forged were radical. prayer could substitute for sacrifice, study could substitute for ritual, and the table of the household could become an altar in miniature. Judaism became a religion of the book, a faith woven from text. The Mishnah, compiled around 200 CE, gathered centuries of oral law, transforming fragile memory into written permanence. Debates and disagreements were preserved, not erased in acknowledgement that truth could be found in dialogue, not uniformity. Synagogues blossomed as new centers of life. No longer merely places of assembly, they became sanctuaries of prayer, study, and community. One could be Jewish in Sepphoris, in Alexandria, in Rome, without a temple in Jerusalem. The rabbis also reshaped messianic expectation. Bar Kokhba's failure was a warning against reckless hopes. Future messiahs would be awaited with patience, not declared with swords. Redemption would come. But until then, survival demanded law, study, and discipline. This transformation was not without tension. Priestly families mourned their lost status, zealots seethed at what they saw as surrender. Yet in the long arc of history, Rabbinic Judaism proved the lifeline of continuity. It allowed a people without land, throne, or temple to endure century after century, exile after exile. The Bar Kokhba revolt revealed the depths of Jewish longing for sovereignty and the terrible costs of challenging Rome. It was a war born of messianic hope, but crushed by imperial power, leaving devastation so profound that Judea ceased to be a Jewish homeland for nearly 2 millennia. The Diaspora, though born in tragedy, became paradoxically a source of strength. Spread across continents, Jews developed a resilience forged in diversity. They were vulnerable, yes, but also adaptably, built to thrive under Persian kings, Roman emperors, and later caliphs and Christian monarchs. Rabbinic Judaism was the great innovation of this period. By shifting focus from sacrifice to scripture, it created a religion portable enough to survive exile, deep enough to sustain centuries, flexible enough to adapt to changing worlds. Without this transformation, Judaism might have vanished into the footnotes of history, as did the religions of Moab, Edom, or Philistia. Instead, it endured in enduring. It continued to shape the moral imagination of the world. For modern readers, these events hold resonance beyond antiquity, tension between empire and identity, between assimilation and survival, between memory and reinvention. These are not ancient concerns alone. They echo in every community that has faced conquest, displacement, or the challenge of preserving culture in diaspora. On a hill overlooking Jerusalem, where the temple once stood, grass now grows between the stones. Tourists wander, pilgrims pray, children laugh. Yet beneath the surface, the earth remembers the cries of rebels, the songs of exiles. The whispered debates of Rabbi Zal are woven into the soil of Judea. History did not end with the temple's destruction. It began again, differently. Out of fire and exile came a new Judaism, a new kind of survival. And as long as the story is told, the ruins are not just ruins, they are foundations. Ancient History of Israel. Chapter 11. Jewish life in the diaspora, a candle in the dark. In the winding alleyways of medieval Toledo, dusk fell against whitewashed walls. From behind a modest shutter, a faint glow broke through. Inside, a family gathered around a wooden table. Father's voice rose, citing blessings over bread and wine, ancient words that had traveled across centuries and continents. His children leaned closer, their faces lit by the flickering Sabbath candles. Outside, church bells tolled vespers. Market stalls closed for the night, but within those narrow walls, time itself seemed to collapse. Exiled centuries earlier from Jerusalem, scattered by Rome's legions, the Jews of Spain carried forward a story that stretched back to Sinai. And this same story was alive elsewhere too. In Cairo, where scholars pored over manuscripts in the Genessa of the Ben Ezra synagogue. In Fez, where Jewish traders in brightly dyed robes sold silks and spices to caravans bound for sub-Saharan Africa. In Mainz, where families huddled in prayer behind thick stone walls as rumors of crusading mobs drew near. Wherever they settled, Jewish communities carried with them a fragile but unbreakable inheritance. Torah scrolls, the rhythm of Sabbath, the covenantal memory of a land lost but never forgotten. This was Jewish life in the diaspora, precarious and enduring, scarred by persecution, but illuminated by astonishing creativity. To trace this life is to wander across continents and centuries, from bustling ports of the Mediterranean to frozen ghettos of northern Europe, from the courts of Muslim sultans to the palaces of Christian kings. It is not just a story of survival. It is a story of shaping societies that often sought to exclude them. This is chapter 11, Jewish life in the diaspora. The first scatterings, when the Second Temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by Rome in 70 CE. The Jewish people were forced into an unfamiliar role, a nation without a homeland. But exile did not begin in 70 CE. Even before that, Jewish communities had flourished abroad. In Alexandria, in Antioch, in Babylon. Scholars debated, merchants traded, families prayed. Yet Rome's conquest widened the scattering on an unprecedented scale. Veterans of Judea's wars were marched to Rome in chains, their labor immortalized on the Colosseum's arches. Others drifted east into the Persian Empire, where great academies like Sura and Pumbedita became the intellectual heart of rabbinic Judaism. In North Africa, Jewish soldiers who once served Rome settled in Carthage and Cyrenaica. Along the trade routes, they acted as cultural brokers. Semitic in language, Mediterranean in dress, faithful to a god unlike those of Rome or the fast-rising church. By late antiquity, Jewish traders were sailing along the coasts of Gaul and Iberia, founding communities in Narbonne, in Cordoba, and Seville. But the early diaspora was never only about exile, it was about adaptation. In Babylon, sages compiled the monumental Talmud, a compendium of law, story, and moral inquiry that would guide Jewish life for centuries. In Egypt, Jews translated their scriptures into Greek, making the Hebrew Bible accessible to the Hellenistic world. And everywhere, synagogues arose, not replicas of the lost temple, but centers of identity and community, places where scripture was read, charity distributed, and disputes resolved. The walls of Jerusalem were gone, but the heartbeat of Jewish life endured. Between Crescent and Cross, by the 7th century, the Arab conquests reshaped the Jewish map. In a few decades, the caliphates stretched from Arabia to the gates of Spain. For Jews, this meant new opportunities and new uncertainties. In Baghdad, under the Abbasids, Jewish merchants became part of a vast network, the Rodhanites, fluent in multiple languages. They traversed deserts, rivers, and seas. They carried silk from China, spices from India, silver from Europe. And everywhere they went, they linked distant Jewish communities, stitching them together with news, letters, and trade. In Spain, under Muslim rule, Jewish life entered its golden age. Protected as people of the book, Jews were not equal to Muslims, but they enjoyed freedoms denied to them in Christian Europe. Cordoba became a jewel of Jewish culture. Philosophers like Moses ben Maimon, remembered as Maimonides, wrestled with questions of reason and revelation. Poets like Judah Halevi sang of both earthly love and the eternal longing for Zion. In Seville and Granada, Jewish viziers served in royal courts, wielding influence as financiers, diplomats, and physicians. This was a world where Jewish voices joined in one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the Middle Ages, shaping science, medicine, poetry, and politics. But shadows lingered. Tolerance was fragile. The fate of entire communities often depended on the temperament of a ruler. A generous caliph could usher in prosperity. A fanatical emir could bring ruin. The Almohad dynasty of the 12th century shattered many Jewish hopes. They demanded conversion or exile. Communities fled. Families broke apart. Even Maimonides was driven from Cordoba, wandering across Morocco before finding refuge in Egypt, where fate placed him as court physician to Sultan Saladin himself. Even in moments of brilliance, exile's shadow never disappeared. The long shadow of Christendom across the Alps and the Pyrenees, in Christian Europe, Jewish life took a harsher turn. Here Jews were both necessary and despised. To kings, they were valuable as sources of tax revenue. To peasants, they were indispensable as lenders. But to the church, they were marked as Christ killers, an eternal reminder of rejection. Barred from land and guilds, Jews often turned to money lending, not from greed, but because few other paths were open. This role, essential but resented, made them targets of hostility. Preachers thundered against usury, painting Jews as sinister figures. Then came the Crusades. In the 11th and 12th centuries, as armies marched eastward to liberate Jerusalem, mobs turned against their Jewish neighbors at home. In the Rhineland mines, Speyer, Worms, entire communities were massacred, families slaughtered, synagogues set ablaze. Men, women, and children chanting the Shema Yisrael as they faced death rather than forced baptism. Chroniclers described rivers of blood in the streets, smoke from burning scrolls rising into the sky. Those who survived retreated behind locked gates, thus emerged the ghettos, Venice, Frankfurt. Narrow alleys where Jews were confined at night, separated from Christian neighbors. But ghettos, though cages, became fortresses of memory. In cramped rooms, children traced Hebrew letters by candlelight. Rabbis argued late into the night over lines of Talmud. Families prepared Sabbath meals with what little they had. Then came the expulsions. England in 1290, France in 1306, Spain in 1492. Communities uprooted overnight, forced to abandon homes, shops, synagogues. The Spanish expulsion was especially devastating. For centuries, Iberian Jewry had flourished. Now, families who had sung in Hebrew and Arabic carried their songs into exile in a new tongue, Ladino, a haunting blend of Hebrew and Castilian Spanish, a language of loss, but also of survival. Cultural and economic contributions, and yet, despite walls and expulsions, Jewish communities made contributions far beyond their size. In science and medicine, Jewish physicians were sought after in both Christian and Muslim courts. Their knowledge of texts, languages, and traditions made them invaluable. Maimonides' medical writings would shape European practice for centuries. In trade, Jewish merchants linked distant worlds. Pepper from India, wax from Russia, wool from England, they kept markets connected. In scholarship, Jews became transmitters of classical knowledge. In Toledo, they helped translate Arabic works on astronomy and philosophy into Latin, igniting sparks that would kindle Europe's Renaissance. In literature, Jewish poets wrote in Hebrew, Arabic, and local tongues. Their verses blended traditions, expressing both faith and longing. In mysticism, the Kabbalah emerged, especially in Spain. It envisioned divine emanations, cosmic repair, and a universe bound together in mystical harmony. These ideas would inspire generations far beyond the Jewish world. Even economically marginalized, Jews found resilience. Tailors in Fez, dyers in Venice, vintners in the Rhineland. Each trade became part of a survival strategy. Festivals, Passover, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, marked time, binding communities to memory. In exile, Jews became at once local and universal, rooted in towns and villages, yet tied by invisible threads to a people spread across oceans. The weight of persecution, but alongside creativity, lay horror. Blood libels spread across Europe. False accusations that Jews kidnapped Christian children for ritual sacrifice. Each rumor sparked terror, leading to massacres. The Black Death of the 14th century brought new catastrophe. Its plague killed millions. Jews were blamed for poisoning wells. Entire communities were burned alive. Yet, even in despair, courage endured. Mothers whispered prayers into their children's ears before execution. Rabbis composed hymns of faith as flames consumed their synagogues. The diaspora was not just exile, it became a crucible, forging a people who endured suffering without losing memory. Analysis and insight: why did the Jews survive when so many other minorities vanished? Part of the answer lies in the nature of Judaism itself. Unlike faiths tied to a single sacred place, Judaism carried its holiness in portable form. Torah, Sabbath, prayer, ritual. A destroyed temple did not mean a destroyed religion. As equally vital was peoplehood. Jews were not only members of a faith, but of a family, a worldwide kinship. Expulsion from one land meant resettlement in another, where fellow Jews offered refuge. Marginalization also brought adaptability. Shut out of power, Jews carved niches in finance, medicine, and scholarship. Paradoxically, exclusion made them indispensable and resilient, and exile itself reshaped Jewish thought. Mystics interpreted suffering as part of a cosmic drama. Philosophers grappled with reason and revelation. Political theologies of patience and endurance emerged. Exile was burden and inspiration at once. And so we return once more to that modest home in Toledo. The Sabbath meal is finished. A father leans back, telling his children stories of Abraham and Sarah, Moses and Miriam, of Jerusalem. Always Jerusalem. Outside, the city belongs to another faith, another empire. But inside, the covenant endures. This was Jewish life in the diaspora. It's not simply survival, but triumph of memory over oblivion. A story written not in palaces or battlefields, but in kitchens, in ghettos, in synagogues, in narrow streets lit by candles. It is the story of a people who could be scattered, despised, persecuted, yet who refused to vanish. And in refusing, they did more than endure. They enriched the civilizations around them. They carried wisdom across oceans. They transformed exile into resilience. The diaspora, in the end, was never just about loss. It was about endurance. It was about creativity. It was about survival and hope. Chapter 12, Islamic Rule and the Crusades. The city shimmered under the desert sun, its limestone walls glowing like ivory against the wide blue sky. It was the year 638 CE. Jerusalem, the city of unyielding stones and unending prayers, waited in uneasy silence. Roman banners had fallen. Byzantine priests whispered anxious litanies, and the streets trembled with anticipation of a new power advancing from the south. Dust rose over the horizon where Arab horsemen, lean and sunburned, approached with the swiftness of the desert wind. At their head rode a man whose name would echo across centuries, Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab. Imagine the tension in the air as Jerusalem's patriarch Sophronius, spiritual heir, 2 centuries of Christian dominion, prepared to hand over the keys of the holy city. Behind him stood the solemn guardians of shrines built on faith and blood. Before him came men who prayed 5 times a day facing Mecca, proclaiming the oneness of God. This was no ordinary surrender. It was a moment when one civilization bowed out and another stepped in not with sword and fire, but with a treaty that would redefine the destiny of the world's most contested city. From that day onward, Jerusalem would pass through hands like a relic too sacred to belong to one people alone. First under the banners of Islam, then claimed by Latin crusaders from Europe, and later retaken by the Kurdish general Saladin, the city became a theater where civilizations clashed again and again. To understand this struggle is to understand not only medieval history, but also the roots of modern passions that burn as fiercely today as they did 9 centuries ago. The Muslim conquest of Jerusalem, 638 CE. The story begins in the wake of the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 CE Arabia. Once fractured by tribal feuds, had been unified under Islam's message. By 636, Muslim armies had already shattered Byzantine power in Syria at the Battle of Yarmouk, a victory so decisive that chroniclers describe the river running red with blood. The Byzantine emperor Heraclius, broken-hearted, is said to have looked back one last time at Antioch and whispered, "Farewell, a long farewell to Syria." But Jerusalem remained. The city fortified, revered, eternal was too important to ignore. Muslim commander Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah besieged it, but Sophronius refused to surrender to anyone except the Caliph himself. So, Umar, the austere second successor to Muhammad, traveled north from Medina. Accounts describe him arriving not on a grand stallion, but on a humble camel. He wore patched garments, an embodiment of the stark simplicity of early Islam. When he entered Jerusalem, there was no massacre, no looting. Instead, a treaty, the Pact of Umar, was signed. Christians were guaranteed protection for their lives, churches, and property, provided they paid the jizya tax. Jews, expelled by the Byzantines, were allowed to return for the first time in centuries. This was transformative. Jerusalem was no longer a peripheral outpost. For Muslims, it was now Al-Quds, the holy, the place where the Prophet Muhammad was believed to have ascended to heaven in the night journey. Upon the ruins of the old Jewish temple, Muslims began to construct the Dome of the Rock. Its golden crown would become one of the world's most recognizable sanctuaries. For nearly 5 centuries, Jerusalem thrived under Islamic stewardship. Pilgrims of all faiths wound their way through its narrow lanes. Markets bustled with silk, spices, and the chatter of Arabic, Greek, and Hebrew tongues. Yet beyond Jerusalem's walls, the Mediterranean world stirred with new ambitions. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem by the late 11th century, Western Europe was poor, fractured, and deeply pious. Tales filtered back from the east of Muslim rulers barring Christian pilgrims from Jerusalem, of desecrated shrines, of cruel indignities. Many of these tales were exaggerated or outright fabricated, but they struck the medieval imagination like thunder. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before the Council of Clermont in France and preached a sermon that would ignite the fury of Europe. Deus vult, God wills it. The crowd cried as knights, peasants, and lords alike took the cross, swearing to march eastward and liberate the Holy Sepulchre. What followed was both a pilgrimage and an invasion. The First Crusade. The march was brutal. Tens of thousands trudged across hostile terrain, leaving behind trails of starvation, disease, and slaughter. By 1099, ragged and half dead, the Crusaders reached Jerusalem. What happened next remains one of history's darkest episodes. Chroniclers describe rivers of blood filling the streets as Crusaders massacred Muslims and Jews indiscriminately. The once pluralistic city, nurtured for centuries under Islamic rule, was transformed into a fortress of exclusion. The Crusaders crowned their conquest by establishing the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a fragile, Latin Christian enclave surrounded by hostile neighbors. Gothic churches rose beside ancient mosques. European lords carved out fiefs and castles, importing feudalism into the Levant. For nearly a century, Jerusalem was a Christian city. Pilgrims from France, England, and Italy flocked to it, marveling at shrines they had dreamed of since childhood. But for Muslims, the loss of Al-Quds was a wound to the soul of the Ummah, a humiliation not just territorial, but spiritual. And in time, a leader would rise to heal it. Saladin, and the Ayyubid control his name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf, Ibn Ayyubanon, in the West simply as Saladin. Born in Tikrit in 1137, he was no mere warrior. Saladin was a statesman, a scholar, and a devout Muslim. In his early years serving under Nur-ad-Din, the ruler of Damascus, he learned that jihad was not only of the sword but also of the spirit. By the 1170s, Saladin had united Egypt and Syria. He built an army of remarkable discipline and positioned himself as the champion of Islam against the Crusader invaders. What set him apart was not only military genius, but his sense of honor. Even his enemies admired him. He showed mercy to captives, refrained from wanton cruelty, and lived by the code of chivalry. The defining moment came in 1187 at the Battle of Hattin. On a blistering July day near the Sea of Galilee, Saladin's forces encircled the Crusader army, parched and exhausted. By the end, the Crusader kingdom was broken. The relic of the true cross was seized. Thousands of knights were taken prisoner, and the road to Jerusalem lay open. When Saladin's banners flew over the holy city, the world held its breath. Would there be another massacre? Another 1099? Instead, Saladin shocked the Christian world by showing restraint. There was no bloodbath. Ransoms were collected, captives released, churches preserved. For Jews, the gates of Jerusalem opened once more. After nearly a century, they returned under Muslim protection. Under the Ayyubids, Jerusalem flourished. Mosques thrived. Scholars and poets gathered. Pilgrims resumed their sacred journeys. Yet the Crusades were far from over. Europe reeled at the loss of Jerusalem. Kings such as Richard the Lionheart launched the Third Crusade in desperate attempts to reclaim it. Richard and Saladin clashed in legendary contests of strategy and will. But Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. The saga of Jerusalem under Islamic and Crusader rule is more than conquests and counter-conquests. It is a mirror reflecting the deepest anxieties and aspirations of civilizations. For Muslims, the conquest of 638 symbolized the justice and tolerance of a new faith. Contrasting with Byzantine exclusion, the Crusader occupation represented arrogance outsiders imposing rule by slaughter. Saladin's recovery of Jerusalem became a touchstone for Islamic pride, proof that even in humiliation, unity and faith could restore dignity. For Christians, the Crusades were a paradox. On one hand, they embodied piety, courage, and sacrifice. On the other, they exposed the brutality and greed lurking beneath the cross. For Jews, these centuries were a pendulum swing between expulsion and refuge, their fate tethered to the struggles of others. The modern resonance is unmistakable. Jerusalem remains contested, claimed holy by Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. It's a memory of Saladin's mercy, the Crusaders' cruelty, and Umar's humility echo even today in political speeches, in popular culture, in the hearts of millions. History here is not past. It is present. As the sun sets over Jerusalem, its golden dome blazing against the twilight, one cannot help but wonder, is this city cursed to forever be the prize of conquerors, or is it sanctified precisely because it endures them all? From Umar's humble camel to Saladin's sword, from Crusader banners to modern conflicts, Jerusalem stands as both promise and warning where heaven and earth meet, and where the ambitions of men are tested against the eternity of stone. Chapter 13. Ancient History of Israel, the Ottoman Period. The call to prayer echoes through the stony hills of Jerusalem. It is the year 1517. A new empire marches through the city gates. Its banners green and gold, its soldiers fierce and disciplined. For the people of Jerusalem, Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike, this is another turn in the wheel of fate. Crusaders, Mamluks, and conquerors have come before, but this time it is different. The Ottomans have arrived and they will rule here for the next 400 years. The arrival of the Ottomans was not only a moment of conquest, it was the beginning of an era that would reshape Jerusalem and Palestine, an era of both tolerance and restriction, of poverty and renewal, of exile and return. The conquest, the Ottoman Empire entered Palestine after the Battle of Marj Dabik in 1516. The Mamluks, weary and corrupt, fell quickly to the armies of Sultan Selim the Stern. By 1517, Jerusalem, Gaza, and the entire land of Palestine stood under Ottoman authority. But the Ottomans were not like the rulers who had come before. They were not local dynasties or passing conquerors. They were an empire stretching from Arabia to North Africa, from the Balkans to the gates of Vienna. Their power was immense, and their presence would last for centuries. For the people of Jerusalem, this meant a new stability, but also a new kind of imperial control. Suleiman, the Magnificent in 1536, the empire's most celebrated ruler. Suleiman the Magnificent turned his attention to Jerusalem. The city, neglected for decades, lay in decay. Its walls crumbled, its aqueducts failed, and its grandeur seemed a memory. Suleiman ordered a transformation. Massive new stone walls rose to encircle the old city. Gates were constructed with strength and beauty. Aqueducts were repaired, fountains built, and the Dome of the Rock was adorned with its brilliant blue tiles. What had been a forgotten provincial town became once more a city of splendor. Pilgrims arriving from Europe and the Middle East alike marveled at the renewed Jerusalem, now safeguarded by the most powerful empire of its age. Religious tolerance and restriction, the Ottoman approach to governance was pragmatic. They ruled through the millet system, which allowed religious communities to govern much of their internal life. Muslims, Christians, and Jews each maintained their own leaders, courts, and traditions. Christians continued to worship at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, though rival sects often fought bitterly over control. Jews prayed at their synagogues and at the Western Wall, their presence tolerated in a way often denied to them in Christian Europe. Yet tolerance did not mean equality. 9 Muslims were classified as dhimmi, protected but subordinate. They were required to pay the jizya tax. They could not bear arms, and their legal rights were limited compared to Muslims. At times of crisis, resentment could erupt into hostility. Still, compared to the Inquisition of Spain or the restrictions of European ghettos, life under the Ottomans seemed far more secure. The early Jewish return. The 16th century brought an important change. In 1492, Spain had expelled its Jews. Tens of thousands fled across the Mediterranean. Many found refuge in the Ottoman Empire, welcomed for their skills as traders, scholars, and physicians. Some of these Sephardic Jews made their way to Palestine. They joined existing communities in Jerusalem, Hebron, and Safed. Safed, perched in the hills of Galilee, became a thriving center of Jewish mysticism. Rabbi Isaac Luria and his disciples taught a new vision of the Kabbalah, inspiring generations with ideas of cosmic repair and spiritual renewal. In Jerusalem, Jews rebuilt synagogues and strengthened their presence, despite poverty and hardship. The Herva synagogue stood as a symbol of resilience, but life was not easy. Disease and famine struck often. Many Jews depended on donations sent from Jewish communities abroad, known as the Halukah. Without this lifeline, survival would have been nearly impossible. Daily life in Ottoman Palestine under Ottoman rule, was a land of contrasts. Fertile fields near Jaffa and Acre produced citrus, olives, and wheat. Bedouin tribes roamed the desert, moving with their herds. Pilgrims from 3 faiths journeyed to holy sites, filling the roads with prayers and songs. But the land was also plagued by hardship. Governors sent from Istanbul often cared little for the province. Taxes were collected harshly, sometimes by corrupt officials who squeezed peasants mercilessly. Banditry plagued the countryside. By the 18th century, Palestine was regarded as a backwater of empire. European travelers described ruined cities and desolate fields. Jerusalem's population dwindled to around 10,000, a fragile mix of Muslims, Christians, and Jews huddled within Suleiman's walls. Yet, despite decline, Jerusalem never lost its aura. To believers across the world, it remained the heart of faith, the place where heaven touched earth. The 19th century awakening, the 19th century changed everything. The Ottoman Empire was weakening, and European powers sought influence in Palestine. Britain, France, and Russia established consulates in Jerusalem. Missionaries built schools and hospitals. Each power used religion as a tool of politics, extending protection to local Christians or Jews. For Jews, this era brought renewal. Philanthropists like Sir Moses Montefiore funded schools, hospitals, and housing. In 1860, the first Jewish neighborhood outside Jerusalem's Old City was built, Mishkanat Shananim. It was a symbol of growth, a step toward the modern city we know today. The Ottomans attempted reforms known as the Tanzimat. New laws promised equality for all subjects, Muslim and non-Muslim alike. Railroads were built, telegraph lines installed, and modern administration introduced. Yet the reforms often remained more promise than reality. Old patterns of discrimination and corruption lingered. Still, the seeds of change had been planted. The rise of Zionism and the end of empire by the late 19th century, Jewish immigration began to increase. Pogroms in Russia and growing anti-Semitism in Europe drove thousands to seek refuge in Palestine. They were inspired by the new movement of Zionism, which called for a return to the ancestral homeland. These pioneers established agricultural colonies, purchased land, and revived Hebrew as a spoken language. For the Ottomans, this was both opportunity and challenge. The newcomers brought investment and energy, but their growing presence threatened to disturb the delicate balance among the communities of Palestine. Ottoman authorities alternated between permitting and restricting Jewish immigration, never fully able to control the situation. Then came the First World War. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers. Palestine became a theater of war. British troops advanced from Egypt, while Arab revolts challenged Ottoman rule from within. In December 1917, British General Edmund Allenby entered Jerusalem. The Ottoman banners were lowered. After 4 centuries, their rule in Palestine was over. The Ottoman centuries are often overlooked, hidden between the drama of the Crusades and the upheavals of the modern age. Yet they were essential. For 400 years, the empire preserved Jerusalem as a city of faiths. It held together fragile communities and allowed exiles, especially Jews, to find refuge in their ancestral land.
No.
The Ottomans ruled with both tolerance and inequality. They sheltered minorities, but always reminded them of their subordinate status. Their neglect left the land impoverished, yet their endurance provided stability that made possible the later transformations of the 19th century. And in their final century, as Europe pressed into the region, Palestine began its modern awakening that would lead directly into the struggles of the 20th century. For centuries of Ottoman rule passed like a long shadow across Jerusalem and Palestine. When the banners of empire fell in 1917, the land stood at the threshold of a new and turbulent era. The stage was set for conflicts and hopes that would shape the modern Middle East and that continued to echo to this very day. Chapter 14, The Road to a Modern State. Zionism and the Jewish National Movement, Basel, Switzerland. August 29, 1897. The old casino building was humming with a nervous electricity. Delegates from across Europe, Praebies lawyers, journalists, and restless young students sat shoulder to shoulder in stiff chairs, their black coats brushing against one another like crows perched on a wire. Outside, the Rhine shimmered in late summer light, while inside, a dream long whispered in exile found its voice. Theodor Herzl, elegant in his dark beard and neatly pressed frock coat, rose to speak. His eyes, heavy with sleepless nights and the burden of centuries, scanned the hall. "We are here," he declared in sonorous German, "to lay the foundation stone of the house which is to shelter the Jewish nation." The words hung in the air like a summons from history itself. Some wept openly, others sat rigid, daring to believe. At that moment, Herzl was not merely a man but a vessel for 2,000 years of longing. The delegates could almost feel the presence of generations. Past fathers and mothers who had lit Sabbath candles in secret under Inquisition Spain, who had trudged through the snows of Russia clutching Torah scrolls, who had whispered the phrase, "Next year in Jerusalem" at Passover tables from Baghdad to Berlin. In Basel, the dream of return shifted from prayer to politics, from a messianic hope to a concrete plan. The birth of a vision. Herzl, and the First Zionist Congress, Herzl was an unlikely prophet. A worldly journalist from Vienna, more at home in the cafes of the Ringstrasse than in a synagogue, he had once believed that emancipation and assimilation would dissolve the Jewish problem. But the 1894 Dreyfus Affair in Paris, where an innocent Jewish officer was paraded in disgrace while mobs screamed death to the Jews, had seared him. France, the cradle of liberty and revolution, had shown him that even the most enlightened societies could not extinguish anti-Semitism. In his pamphlet Der Judenstaat, The Jewish State, published in 1896, Herzl argued with clarity and urgency. The Jews were not simply a religious minority but a nation bound by history and destiny, and as a nation, they required a homeland. It was not sentimentality, but necessity. So the answer was political Zionism, modernized, modern, and relentless. The Basel Congress of 1897 crystallized that vision. Nearly 200 delegates convened under Herzl's leadership. Drafting the Basel Program, Zionism seeks to establish a home for the Jewish people in Palestine, secured under public law. To many, the words seemed audacious, even impossible. Yet Herzl, with his orators' fire and journalists' gift for spectacle, understood that a seed planted in the imagination could one day grow into a state. Later in his diary, he wrote a line that has become prophetic. "In Basel, I founded the Jewish state. Perhaps in 5 years, and certainly in 50, everyone will know it." The waves of Aliyah. The dream would not remain in European Congress halls. It would take form in footsteps, in calloused hands, in plows cutting into stubborn soil. First Aliyah, 1882 to 1903. Even before Herzl, groups of Jews driven by pogroms in Russia and poverty in Eastern Europe had begun arriving in Ottoman Palestine. They came in trickles, known collectively as the First Aliyah. Families from villages in Ukraine and Romania sold what little they had and boarded ships bound for Jaffa. The port, reeking of salt and sweat, greeted them not with grandeur, but with chaos donkeys braying, stevedores shouting in Arabic and Greek. They purchased land, often at great cost, from absentee landlords in Beirut and Damascus, and set about draining malarial swamps and coaxing wheat from rocky fields. The settlements they founded, Pita, Tikva, Rishon LeZion, Zikron Yaakov, were fragile, plagued by disease and Arab raids. Many settlers despaired and returned to Europe, yet others persevered, sustained by donations from the French philanthropist Baron Edmond de Rothschild, who became the unlikely patron of this pioneering dream. Second, Aliyah 1904 to 1914. If the first Aliyah was a hesitant experiment, the second was a revolution. Sparked by renewed pogroms in Russia and the disillusionment of young radicals after the failed 1905 revolution, thousands of idealistic youths made their way to Palestine. They were not simply escaping persecution, they were coming to build a new society. They spoke of Aliyah not merely as immigration, but as a Senta returned both spiritual and physical. Clad in rough work clothes, they rejected dependence on philanthropy and insisted on avoda ivrit Hebrew labor. They built the first kibbutzim collective farms where property and profits were shared, and where men and women labored side by side. The air of Galilee rang with hammer blows and Hebrew songs and chantant words reborn on young lips. Among them was David Ben-Gurion, a short, intense man with unruly hair, who arrived from Poland in 1906. He would one day become Israel's first prime minister. But in those early years, he hoed fields, taught Hebrew, and absorbed the ethos of pioneering sacrifice. Later waves, the Third Aliyah, followed World War I. When the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and Britain's conquest of Palestine seemed to promise official recognition. The fourth and fifth waves, in the 1920s and 1930s, brought middle-class Jews from Poland and professionals fleeing Nazi Germany. Each wave carried its own character: peasants, socialists, bourgeois families. Refugees, but together, they transformed the demography and landscape of Palestine. Tensions with the Arab population, yet the land was not empty. Palestine, under Ottoman rule and later the British Mandate, was home to an Arab population, Muslim and Christian, who tilled its fields, prayed in its mosques and churches, and traced their own roots to centuries past. At first, relations were wary, but not hostile. Jewish settlers bought land legally, often from absentee landlords, and many Arabs welcomed the economic activity: railways, orange groves, new markets. But as Jewish immigration grew and the Zionist aim of establishing a homeland became clear, fear deepened. To the Arab fella, watching newcomers drain his swamp and fence off once shared pastures, it seemed less an ascent than an encroachment. Clashes began: sporadically stone-throwing in Jaffa, disputes over wages, skirmishes between guards and villagers. By 1920, they erupted into riots. The Palestinian Arab leadership, alarmed by both Zionist ambitions and British support for them, organized protests and strikes. The seeds of a bitter conflict had been sown to peoples, both laying claim to the same soil, both armed with history and memory. Zionism was not a single monolith, but a tapestry of ideas. Herzl's political Zionism sought international recognition and diplomacy. Labor Zionists, inspired by socialist ideals, envisioned a just society forged by sweat and solidarity. Religious Zionists saw settlement as a fulfillment of divine promise. Revisionists under Zivia Botinsky, more militant, argued for a strong defense and territorial maximalism. What united them was a recognition that Jewish life in Europe was precarious and that assimilation could not guarantee safety. Zionism was, at once, an answer to centuries of persecution and an audacious gamble on the future. The tension with the Arabs of Palestine was not an accidental byproduct, but an inherent contradiction, a national movement seeking to establish itself in a land already inhabited. The Zionist dream of a land without a people, for a people without a land, collided with the lived reality of Palestinian Arabs, whose sense of dispossession would harden into resistance. For the Jews, each pogrom in Russia, each discriminatory law in Poland, and finally the looming shadow of Nazism reinforced the urgency: if not Palestine, where? For the Arabs, each new ship docking in Jaffa carried a reminder that their homeland might slip away. When Herzl left Basel in 1897, he returned to Vienna, a man both celebrated and ridiculed. The European press dismissed his Congress as a fantasy. Yet within 50 years, as he had predicted, a Jewish state would indeed rise. Theodor Herzl would not live to see it. He died in 1904, worn down at just 44. But his vision, kindled in that crowded hall in Basel, became the axis around which Jewish history would turn. The Zionist movement was not born in triumph, but in longing, labor, and conflict. It was the story of a people reaching back to an ancient past while straining toward an uncertain future. And it was the story of a landed soil tilled by many hands, its hills echoing with competing prayers, where dreams of redemption and fears of loss intertwined. As the 20th century advanced, those tensions would deepen into open confrontation, shaping the destiny not only of Jews and Arabs, but of the entire modern Middle East. Chapter 15: World War I and the British Mandate. History of Israel, a promise written in smoke, The autumn of 1917 was thick with uncertainty, and yet the smell of wet earth in Europe was mingled with something sharper cordite, blood, and the dying gasps of empires. In a London office, lit by the gray drizzle filtering through frosted windows, a man leaned over a desk, his pen scratching against parchment. Arthur James Balfour, Britain's Foreign Secretary, was not a man given to sentiment. Yet as he signed his name to the letter that would carry his legacy, he could not have imagined the firestorm it would unleash. That short declaration addressed not to a government, but to Lord Rothschild, the scion of a powerful Jewish family, spoke of sympathy with Jewish aspirations for a national home in Palestine. It was barely 2 sentences long, but it carried the weight of centuries of longing and centuries of conflict yet to come. Outside, the war thundered on, swallowing men by the tens of thousands in muddy trenches. But here in the quiet of Whitehall, the seeds of a new war one that would rage for generations were quietly planted. The words of the Balfour Declaration floated across the Jewish world like a spark striking dry tinder. For Zionists, weary from decades of lobbying and ridicule, it was a miracle, a sudden recognition from one of the greatest powers on earth. For the Arab inhabitants of Palestine, who had been told they too would be free after Ottoman rule collapsed, it was a betrayal, a shadow cast across their sunlit hope. Both peoples, locked in the same narrow strip of land, now carried the weight of promises made in wartime whispers. The Great War and the fall of the Ottoman curtain to understand the British mandate. One must first return to the collapsing Ottoman Empire, the so-called sick man of Europe. For centuries, Palestine had been a quiet province of that sprawling realm, its peasants tilling stony soil, its merchants bartering in the souk of Jerusalem, its pilgrims trudging toward shrines sacred to 3 faiths. Ottoman governance was distant and often corrupt, but it was familiar. It provided a kind of rhythm. Taxes paid, disputes settled by cadis, soldiers marching only occasionally through village streets. Then the Great War tore the curtain apart. In 1914, the Ottomans joined Germany, dragging their provinces into a European inferno. Suddenly, Palestine was no longer a quiet backwater, but a battlefield. Turkish troops marched south to the Sinai, only to be beaten back by British and Commonwealth forces. By 1917, General Edmund Allenby's armies were advancing northward, taking Gaza, Jaffa, and finally, Jerusalem itself. When Allenby entered Jerusalem on foot, he did so deliberately, out of respect for the holy city. Crowds gathered on the cobbled streets, watching this tall, solemn Englishman stride through the Jaffa Gate. For Christians, his presence recalled the Crusaders of old. For Jews, it hinted at deliverance.
No.
For Muslims, it was the beginning of an uncertain future. The Ottoman curtain had fallen, but what play would replace it was far from clear. The Balfour Declaration, a promise and a puzzle. The Balfour Declaration did not spring from pure altruism. Britain, fighting for its life against Germany, was desperate for allies and sympathetic publics. Some in Whitehall believed that supporting Zionist aspirations would rally Jews in Russia and America, bolstering the Allied cause. Others, influenced by Bible-soaked upbringings, saw it as a fulfillment of prophecy. Still others believed that a Jewish homeland under British protection would secure a strategic foothold near the Suez Canal, the empire's lifeline to India. Chaim Weizmann, the chemist-turned-Zionist leader, had played his part well. His scientific work, developing a synthetic process for acetone, vital to British munitions, gave him access to ministers who otherwise might have dismissed Zionist dreams as fantasy. With patience and charm, he pressed his case, framing Jewish aspirations not as a romantic whim, but as a practical boon to the empire. And so Balfour's letter was written, spoke of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, carefully balanced by the caveat that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. The ambiguity was deliberate, a diplomat's artful vagueness, but on the ground, in the villages of Galilee and the crowded alleys of Jerusalem, that ambiguity was a ticking bomb. British rule between promise and reality, when the League of Nations granted Britain the mandate over Palestine in 1922, was in effect giving legal cover to what Allenby's soldiers had already secured by force. Britain now found itself master of a land that was both ancient and volatile, a land that resisted being neatly categorized or icily ruled. In the first years, British officials tried to project calm order. They built roads, set up police stations, and introduced British legal codes. They also facilitated Jewish immigration, citing the Balfour Declaration. Ships arrived at Jaffa's harbor carrying new settlers. Some were idealistic young pioneers, sunburned and determined to build kibbutzim from swamp and stone. Others were intellectuals fleeing pogroms and poverty in Eastern Europe. For them, the British flag over Jerusalem symbolized a new chapter of security and progress. But for the Arab population, still the majority, each new ship was a reminder of dispossession. Farmers who had tilled their fields for generations now found absentee landlords selling land to Zionist organizations. And suddenly, they were tenants no more. The new Hebrew-speaking settlements, with their cooperative farms and guarded perimeters, seemed less like neighbors and more like outposts of another nation being built in their midst. British administrators schooled in the arts of empire tried to straddle the fence. They issued white papers to reassure Arabs, while simultaneously reaffirming their commitments to Zionists. The result was that neither side trusted them. In the Jaffa, Arabs muttered about betrayal. In the halls of the Zionist Commission, Jews complained of obstruction. The spark of unrest, the first major clash, came in 1920, when riots erupted in Jerusalem during the Nebi Musa festival. What began as religious fervor quickly turned to violence, with Arab crowds attacking Jewish neighborhoods. The British, unprepared, struggled to restore order. 6 Jews were killed, hundreds wounded. For many Zionists, the lesson was bitterly clear. The British could not be relied upon for protection. Soon, self-defense organizations like the Hagan embryos of a future army took root. By 1921, more riots flared in Jaffa, leaving scores dead. The streets reeked of blood and smoke, shutters were smashed, and frightened families huddled in basements. Arabs too saw their dead carried through narrow alleys, their funerals swelling into protests. Each side told itself a story of victimhood, and both were true. For the British, the mandate was becoming a poisoned chalice. High commissioners sent reports back to London that dripped with frustration. The Jews were too demanding, the Arabs too restless, the promises too contradictory. Yet Britain, unwilling to retreat, tightened its grip, layering Palestine with garrisons, intelligence networks, and bureaucratic decrees between two promises. The tragedy of the British mandate lay not only in its violence, but in its duplicity. While promising Jews a national home, Britain had also whispered to Arab leaders during the war that they would gain independence if they revolted against the Ottomans. The famous McMahon-Hussein correspondence dangled visions of an Arab kingdom stretching across the Levant. To add to the confusion, the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 had already carved the Middle East into spheres of British and French control. Thus, Arabs felt cheated, promised freedom, given instead a foreign yoke and a swelling tide of settlers. Jews, meanwhile, believed themselves sanctioned by international law and moral right, yet constantly hemmed in by British half-measures. The stage was set for decades of mistrust and fury. The gathering storm by the late 1920s, unrest simmered into open conflict. In 1929, violence exploded over access to the Western Wall in Jerusalem. What began as a dispute over prayer rights escalated into massacres, most infamously in Hebron, where Arab mobs killed 67 Jews, many of them old men, women, and children who had lived peacefully among Arab neighbors for generations. The British, once again, arrived late, their soldiers marching through streets slick with blood, their rifles too slow to stop the killing. The trauma of Hebron seared into Jewish memory, convincing even moderates that coexistence might be a dream slipping away. For Arabs, the violence was framed as resistance to a creeping colonization, a desperate act of defense. Throughout the 1930s, Jewish immigration surged especially. With the rise of Nazism in Europe, the conflict intensified. Arab strikes, British reprisals, Jewish underground activity. The mandate became a crucible of hatred, every act of violence feeding the next. The weight of promises. The British mandate in Palestine is one of history's starkest examples of imperial overreach tangled in moral paradox. Britain, victorious in war, imagined it could engineer stability with a blend of diplomacy, bureaucracy, and bayonets. Instead, it found itself mired in a conflict that no amount of reports or royal commissions could resolve. The Balfour Declaration was both visionary and reckless. It gave hope to a people scattered by centuries of exile, yet it did so without consulting the people already living in the land. The ambiguity of a national home was not a bridge but a trap. For Jews read it as statehood in embryo, while Arabs read it as dispossession in plain sight. For Western readers today, the resonance is profound. The dilemmas of Palestine under the British Mandate, conflicting national aspirations, colonial manipulations, promises made in smoke-filled rooms echo in every negotiation and every eruption of violence in the modern Middle East. On a winter evening in Jerusalem, under the fading light of the Mandate years, British soldiers once stood at checkpoints, while Jewish settlers trudged past with shovels and rifles, and Arab farmers led their donkeys along dusty tracks, their eyes wary, their hearts heavy. The Union Jack fluttered above government buildings, but no one mistook it for permanence. Britain had promised too much to too many, and the land itself seemed to tremble under the weight of those promises. The Mandate was not merely an episode of imperial administration, it was the crucible in which two peoples, both with deep claims and deep wounds, collided under the shadow of an empire that could neither fully control them nor fully let them go. In the smoke of World War I, a declaration had been written. In the dust of Palestine, it became a destiny. Chapter 16. Holocaust and Statehood. History of Israel, the winter of 1945, hung heavy over Europe. The war was ending, yet silence carried its own horror. In the forests of Poland, snow still covered the ruins of villages once alive with children's laughter. In Germany, Allied soldiers walked through the gates of Dachau and Bergen-Belsen, their boots sinking into the mud of camps where skeletal figures' eyes wide with disbeliefs daggered toward them. A soldier later recalled, "We didn't liberate them. They liberated us from ignorance." The air was thick with the stench of death, the collapse of an entire civilization's moral order. For the Jewish people, there was no triumphant homecoming. 6 million had been exterminated: mothers, fathers, rabbis, poets, tailors, doctors, and children who never had the chance to dream. Survivors carried not only tattooed numbers on their arms, but also the unbearable weight of memory. Europe, once a vibrant center of Jewish life, was now a graveyard. Yet, even as the ashes of Auschwitz blew across the continent, a new chapter was struggling to be born. Out of the worst catastrophe in Jewish history came the urgent, unstoppable drive towards statehood. The question was no longer abstract. Could the Jews survive without a homeland of their own? Oh, Nazi persecution and the Holocaust? The Holocaust did not erupt overnight. It grew like a cancer from the soil of centuries of anti-Semitism in Europe. Adolf Hitler, rising to power in 1933, made the Jew the embodiment of Germany's humiliation after World War I. His speeches dripped with venom, depicting Jews as both parasites and conspirators. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped German Jews of citizenship, forbade intermarriage, and reduced them to outcasts in the land they had called home for centuries. Jewish shop windows were shattered on Kristallnacht in November 1938. When synagogues burned while firefighters stood idly by, broken glass crunched underfoot as Jewish families huddled in fear. For some, this was the moment they understood. There would be no safety left in Europe, yet emigration was difficult. Few countries would take in Jews in significant numbers. British-controlled Palestine was restricted by quotas. When war began in 1939, persecution turned into annihilation. The invasion of Poland brought nearly 3 million Jews under Nazi control. Ghettos were walled off in Warsaw and Vilna. Starvation was deliberate. Policy ration cards allowed Jews only a fraction of the food Germans received. In one diary, a child wrote of watching his younger brother die after trading a family heirloom for a crust of bread. Then, in 1941, as Nazi armies stormed into the Soviet Union, the policy escalated. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, followed the Wehrmacht, shooting Jews by the tens of thousands in ravines and forests. At Babi Yar near Kyiv, 33,000 Jews were executed in just 2 days. Survivors remembered the earth moving for days afterward as the mass graves settled. By 1942, the final solution had been devised at the Wannsee Conference. Deportations by cattle cars brought millions to extermination camps. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Majdanek, Chelmno. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the chimneys belched smoke day and night. Families arrived, clutching children, unaware that selections on the ramp meant immediate death for most. Zyklon B gas hissed through vents, silencing voices within minutes. The smell of burning flesh spread across the countryside. The scale of destruction was almost beyond comprehension. Out of Europe's pre-war Jewish population of 9 million, 2/3 were murdered. Communities that had thrived for centuries, polished shtetls, German intellectual circles, Lithuanian yeshivas were wiped off the map. And yet, amid despair, there were sparks of resistance. In April 1943, the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto rose up with smuggled pistols and homemade bombs. For nearly a month, they defied the Nazi war machine, choosing to die fighting rather than be led like cattle. Their courage reverberated across Jewish memory, a testament to dignity in the face of annihilation. The refugee crisis after World War II, when the war ended in May 1945, liberation brought little solace. Survivors emerged from the camps weighing barely 80 pounds, their faces hollowed, their families gone. Some tried to return to their hometowns, only to be met with hostility. In Kielce, Poland, a pogrom in 1946 killed 42 returning Jews, proving that anti-Semitism had not died with Hitler. For many survivors, Europe was no longer home, but a vast graveyard. Displaced persons DP camps sprang up in Germany, Austria, and Italy. These were grim places, barbed wire, overcrowding, and despair. Yet within them, Jewish life stubbornly rekindled. Schools were organized, theaters performed Yiddish plays, rabbis officiated weddings. Babies were born the first generation after the Holocaust, symbolizing defiance. The question burned: where could they go? The United States, though sympathetic, maintained immigration quotas. Britain, still controlling Palestine, restricted Jewish immigration under pressure from Arab leaders who opposed the creation of a Jewish majority. The 1939 White Paper had set a limit of 75,000 Jewish immigrants over 5 years, a ceiling reached during the war. For survivors, these restrictions felt like a second betrayal. Zionist organizations took the lead, smuggling Jews into Palestine aboard rickety ships. One such vessel, the Exodus 1947, carried over 4,500 Holocaust survivors, but was intercepted by the British Navy. Images of emaciated survivors being forced back to Europe shocked the world and turned public opinion against Britain. American President Harry Truman pressed Britain to allow 100,000 Jewish refugees into Palestine. But the British, weary from war and fearing unrest in the Middle East, resisted. Violence in Palestine escalated, with Jewish underground groups like the Haganah and Irgun launching attacks on British targets. The refugee crisis had become inseparable from the question of Jewish statehood. The UN partition plan by 1947, Britain admitted defeat. Unable to reconcile Jewish and Arab claims, it turned the problem over to the newly formed United Nations Special Committee on SCOP toured Palestine, listening to testimonies from Jews and Arabs alike. Survivors of the camps, speaking before the committee, moved many delegates to tears. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted on Resolution 181. The Partition Plan. It proposed dividing Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem under international administration. In the hall, Jewish delegates wept with joy as the tally reached the necessary 2/3 majority. For the first time in 2 millennia, international legitimacy was given to a Jewish state. The Arab leadership, however, rejected the plan outright. To them, it was an injustice. Why should Palestinians lose their land because Europeans had committed crimes against the Jews? Riots broke out, and violence between Jewish and Arab communities intensified. Yet for Jews, particularly Holocaust survivors, the vote was a lifeline. Golda Meir later recalled, "After we lost 6 million people, we could not afford to lose this opportunity." The dream of statehood, cherished since the days of Herzl and nurtured through decades of struggle, was now within reach. Declaration of the State of Israel, 1948. On May 14, 1948, in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion stood before a crowded hall, his hair disheveled, his voice steady. The British mandate was ending at midnight. At 4 p.m., he read aloud the Declaration of Independence. We hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, act to be known as the State of Israel. The room erupted in applause, tears, and song. Outside, crowds danced in the streets, waving flags, embracing strangers. For a people who had walked through the valley of death, this was resurrection. Survivors who had staggered out of Auschwitz 3 years earlier now saw a nation reborn, yet celebration was shadowed by the looming storm. Even as the declaration was signed, Arab armies from Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq prepared to invade. The following day, war erupted, the first Arab-Israeli war. The newborn state faced annihilation from the moment of its birth, but the symbolism of that day cannot be overstated. For Jews across the world, May 14th was redemption. The Holocaust had proven that assimilation offered no guarantee of survival. Only sovereignty, they believed, could ensure safety. The Holocaust and the creation of Israel are inseparable in modern history. The Holocaust destroyed the illusion that Jews could rely on the goodwill of host nations. Centuries of diaspora life had culminated in catastrophe. Statehood was no longer a matter of aspiration but of survival. The refugee crisis after 1945 underscored this reality. With doors closed in Europe and America, the world witnessed displaced survivors wandering with nowhere to go. Palestine became not merely a choice, but the only viable refuge. For Arabs, however, the partition plan was an injustice imposed by foreign powers at their expense. Their rejection reflected both national pride and fear of displacement. This clash of narratives, Jewish survival versus Arab dispossession, would ignite decades of conflict. The Declaration of Israel in 1948 marked a turning point not only for Jews but for the entire Middle East. It transformed the Jewish people from victims of history to actors shaping their destiny. But it also set the stage for one of the most intractable conflicts of the modern era. From the ashes of Auschwitz rose the State of Israel, a rebirth so improbable it seemed almost biblical. The same trains that had once carried Jews to death camps were now carrying them to Haifa and Tel Aviv, where they stepped onto the soil of a homeland reborn. The world had witnessed both the darkest night and the dawning of a new day. History rarely grants neat resolutions. For the Jewish people, 1948 was not an end, but a beginning forged in fire, shadowed by tragedy, yet illuminated by hope. Chapter 17. War of Independence in Early Years. History of Israel, the night of May 14, 1948 in Tel Aviv, smelled of sweat, dust, and cigarettes. In a small hall on Rothschild Boulevard, the atmosphere was charged with history. Men in worn suits and women with tired eyes, many of them survivors of Europe. Infernos pressed together as David Ben-Gurion, his hair a shock of white, stood at the podium. The declaration in his hand trembled, not only from age, but from the gravity of the moment. He read the words slowly, each syllable heavy. We hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, to be known as the State of Israel. Outside, car horns erupted, people danced in the streets, and tears ran down the faces of those who had survived exile and slaughter. They kissed the ground, held each other, and whispered blessings. But underneath the jubilation was a deeper fear. For the young state was born under siege. Even as Tel Aviv's cafes rang with music and clinking glasses, Arab armies were massing on every border. A day after independence, the skies would darken with planes and the fields echo with gunfire. The new nation had drawn its first breath amid jubilation and terror. The world had witnessed the impossible. A people who had nearly been annihilated in Europe had returned to sovereignty in their ancient homeland. Yet the ink on the declaration was barely dry when war thundered in. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The war began before it was officially declared. In truth, civil strife had already engulfed the land since the UN partition plan of November 1947, which proposed dividing Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. The Jewish Agency had accepted it reluctantly, seeing it as a step towards statehood. But Arab leaders rejected it outright, viewing it as a theft of land. From December 1947 to May 1948, what historians call the Civil War phase raged across Palestine. Arab irregulars and local militias attacked Jewish convoys, settlements, and neighborhoods. Roads were ambushed, food shipments cut off. The lifeline to Jerusalem, a twisting road through hostile hills, was besieged, leaving the Jewish quarter starving. The Jewish community, known as the Yeshuv, responded with hastily organized defense forces. The Haganah, an underground militia that had long prepared for such a moment, transformed into a proto-army. Young men and women, many fresh from DP camps in Europe, found rifles thrust into their hands. Others joined the more radical groups, the Ergun and Lahihu's tactics of bombings and reprisals, left deep scars and controversies that echo still. Then came May 15, 1948. At midnight, as the British lowered their flag and sailed away, 5 Arab armies invaded: Egypt from the south, Jordan's Arab Legion from the east, Syria and Lebanon from the north, and Iraq through the Jordan Valley. They outnumbered the fledgling Israeli forces nearly 3-1, with tanks, artillery, and air power that Israel did not yet possess. The battles were savage, desperate, and intimate. In the Negev desert, Israeli fighters held out against Egyptian armor with little more than Molotov cocktails and old Czech rifles. In Jerusalem, young Palmach fighters tunneled through ancient alleys and carried food on their backs to feed the besieged Jewish quarter. In the north, kibbutz farmers fought from their fields, transforming plows into barricades. International volunteers arrived to mackle fighters, Jews and non-Jews alike. Veterans of World War II who could fly planes or man artillery. Clandestine operations brought in weapons from Czechoslovakia, a lifeline that tilted the balance at crucial moments. The cost was immense. By the time the armistices were signed in 1949, Israel had lost nearly 1% of its population, 6,000. Dead out of 650,000 Jews. Every family carried grief. But Israel had not only survived, it had expanded beyond the UN partition borders, seizing territories in Galilee, the Negev, and much of central Palestine. For the Palestinians, however, the war was remembered as Onakbo's the catastrophe. Some 700,000 Arab inhabitants fled or were expelled from their homes, creating a refugee crisis that would fester for decades, shaping the conflict to come. In the smoky ruins of Lida, Ramel, and Jaffa, history left wounds that still bleed. Mass immigration and nation building, even as the guns fell silent, another flood began this time of people. Israel was not simply a state for its residents, it declared itself a homeland for Jews everywhere, and they came in ships and planes, often with nothing but a suitcase or the clothes on their backs. From the displaced persons camps of Germany and Austria, survivors of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen staggered off ships, eyes hollow yet burning with determination. From Yemen and Iraq, Jews poured in through clandestine airlifts operation, Magic Carpet 1949-50, whisked nearly 50,000 Yemenite Jews into Israel. Their centuries-old communities vanishing overnight. In 1951, Operation Ezra and Nehemiah brought more than 120,000 Iraqi Jews, many of them stripped of property and citizenship. By the early 1950s, Israel's population had doubled. This was both a miracle and a crisis. Tent camps, known as Mubarat, sprawled across the land. Families lived in corrugated shacks, mud huts, or canvas tents that leaked in the winter rains and baked in the summer sun. Malnutrition was rampant, unemployment high. Ben-Gurion's government faced an impossible task: absorb masses of immigrants while building institutions, an economy, and an army all in the shadow of hostile neighbors. Yet there was also a heady sense of mission. The revival of Hebrew as a living language bound together immigrants from Morocco, Poland, Iran, and Russia. Kibbutzim absorbed orphans and refugees, teaching them to farm and to fight. Schools mushroomed, hospitals were built, and universities expanded. But tensions lurked. Ashkenazi Jews from Europe often looked down on Mizrahi Jews from Middle Eastern and North African countries, dismissing their traditions as backward. Many Sephardi families were relegated to development towns in the desert or periphery, far from Tel Aviv's cultural heart. The scars of this divide would echo through Israeli politics for generations. Challenges in economy, security, and diplomacy, the early 1950s, were years of grinding austerity. Israel had no oil, few natural resources, and a devastated agricultural base. Food was rationed. Bread, sugar, and eggs were scarce. Families received coupons, and children stood in long queues for milk. Imported goods were luxuries. The economy relied on international loans, contributions from diaspora Jews, and eventually, controversial reparations from West Germany. Security remained fragile. Though the 1949 armistices had ended open warfare, Israel's borders were tense and porous. Palestinian refugees, now in camps across Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, and Jordan, often crossed back to tend their fields or reclaim possessions. Israel labeled them infiltrators and responded with harsh reprisals. Arab states refused to recognize Israel and spoke openly of future war. Diplomatically, Israel walked a tightrope. It sought legitimacy among Western powers, aligning closely with the United States, while also relying on France for arms. The Soviet Union, initially supportive due to its own anti-colonial stance, soon cooled as the Cold War hardened and Israel tilted westward. In the United Nations, Israel often found itself isolated, facing resolutions critical of its policies. At home, politics were dominated by Ben-Gurion and his Mapai party. His vision was one of self-reliance, pioneering labor, and military readiness. He believed the army, now the Israel Defense Forces IDF, should be the crucible of national identity, uniting immigrants and creating a disciplined citizenry. He demanded sacrifice, sometimes ruthlessly, pushing the nation to prioritize defense and settlement over comfort. Yet amid hardship, there was resilience. The arts flourished, theaters opened, poets wrote in modern Hebrew, and musicians blended European and Middle Eastern traditions. Sports leagues formed, radio crackled with news in Hebrew, and for the first time in 2,000 years, Jewish farmers worked their land not as tenants but as sovereign citizens. The War of 1948 and the early years that followed were formative crucibles for Israel. The war had secured independence, but at enormous cost, entrenching the dual narratives of triumph and catastrophe that remained locked in tension between Israelis and Palestinians. Mass immigration transformed Israel from a small enclave into a diverse, crowded, and often fractious society. Without the influx of Jews from Arab lands, Israel would not have survived demographically. Yet the struggles of absorption housing, employment, cultural prejudice planted seeds of social divides that still shape Israeli politics. Economically, the years of rationing forced innovation and discipline, setting the stage for later growth. Diplomatically, Israel's early isolation honed a culture of self-reliance and suspicion of international institutions, attitudes that echo into the 21st century. Above all, the story of these years is one of paradox, a people traumatized by persecution building a state of extraordinary resilience. While in other people, the Palestinians experienced dispossession and exile, the symmetry of joy and despair, of homecoming and catastrophe, lies at the heart of the conflict that continues to shape the region. On a humid evening in Tel Aviv in 1952, a group of immigrant children played soccer in the dust of a Mubarak camp. Their ball was patched with tape. Their laughter rang across the tents. Nearby, their parents stood in line for rationed bread, weary but unbroken. Behind them, cranes rose over new apartment blocks, and the Hebrew language filled the air like an incantation. The state of Israel had been born in fire and hunger, in triumph and mourning. Its survival was uncertain, its challenges immense. Yet in the faces of those children, barefoot in the dust, yet speaking a language resurrected from ancient scripture, one could glimpse the stubborn miracle of nationhood. The story of Israel's early years is not one of peace or prosperity, but of survival, resilience, and the audacity to dream. It was a beginning written in sweat and sacrifice, a prologue to struggles yet to come. Chapter 18. Wars and Peace Efforts. History of Israel, Six-Day War. 1967, Yom Kippur. War 1973. Peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan. The desert was still when dawn broke on June 5, 1967. The air above the Sinai shimmered with heat. A deceptive calm before the thunder. At precisely 7:45 a.m., a low rumble rose from the west. It grew, multiplied, until the sky seemed to tremble. Over 200 Israeli fighter jets, flying so low they nearly skimmed the desert sand, poured across the frontier toward Egypt. The operation had a name whispered only in high command focus. In less than an hour, the balance of the Middle East would tilt on its axis. Inside Israel, families sat glued to transistor radios, the lifeline of a nation perpetually at war with its neighbors. Mothers whispered prayers, children were hushed. In Tel Aviv, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol paced his office chain-smoking, knowing that if the gamble failed, the fledgling Jewish state might not survive its third decade. Across the Arab world, leaders had spoken of pushing Israel into the sea. Now the moment of truth had come. What unfolded over the following 6 days would become legendary and improbable. Lightning-quick victory that redrew the map of the Middle East, but the triumph of 1967 carried within it the seeds of future agony. 6 years later, in 1973, on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, Israel would be caught off guard, bleeding, shaken to its core in the Yom Kippur War. And yet, out of these wars, out of loss and stubborn resilience, would emerge the first true peace between Israel and an Arab neighbor, Egypt and later, Jordan. This chapter is the story of that perilous dance between fire and reconciliation, between sword and olive branch. The Six-Day War, 1967. A nation on the edge, the road to war in 1967 was not a single path, but a tangle of threats, bluffs, and miscalculations. In May of that year, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, the charismatic voice of Arab nationalism, ordered United Nations peacekeepers out of the Sinai Peninsula. Within days, he massed Egyptian troops along Israel's border and blockaded the Straits of Tiran. Cutting off Israeli shipping a move, Israel had long declared a casus belli. In Israel, the mood was electric with fear. Newspapers printed maps showing Arab armies encircling the small nation, their leaders vowing its destruction. In whispers spread of a second Holocaust, this time in the desert, men and women rushed to volunteer, not only for the army but for funeral societies preparing for mass casualties. And yet beneath the anxiety was also a defiance. "We will not die again," one Israeli reservist told a journalist as he boarded his bus for the front. The government hesitated. Prime Minister Eshkol, a cautious man, dithered on live radio, fumbling his words. The public's confidence wavered. Only when General Moshe Dayan, with his iconic black eye patch and aura of warrior poet, was appointed defense minister, did morale stiffen. Behind the scenes, Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin wrestled with insomnia and chain-smoked to steady his nerves. On June 5th, Israel struck first. Its pilots flew a daring mission. At dawn, they swooped down on Egyptian airfields, catching the planes still lined up wing to wing. In hours, the Egyptian Air Force was reduced to twisted metal. Jordan and Syria, misled by Egyptian claims of victory, joined the fray, only to suffer similar fates. Israel's tiny air force now dominated the skies. On the ground, Israeli armored divisions slashed through the Sinai with breathtaking speed. In Jerusalem, paratroopers fought a ferocious battle for the Old City. On June 7th, as the shofar sounded by the Western Wall for the first time in nearly 2 millennia, soldiers wept openly, their rifles slung across their shoulders. "The Temple Mount is in our hands," Colonel Madagur declared. For many Jews around the world, it was a biblical moment, history collapsing into the present. By the war's end, Israel had captured the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. In just 6 days, the nation had tripled its territory. The Arab world was humiliated, its armies shattered. Yet for Israel, victory was bittersweet. The lands won contained more than geography, they contained millions of Palestinians, whose national aspirations would now collide head-on with the Jewish state. The aftermath, triumph and dilemma, the euphoria of 1967, was intoxicating. In Tel Aviv, crowds danced in the streets, waving flags, singing folk songs that promised eternal return. Synagogues overflowed with worshippers giving thanks. The Jewish diaspora felt a surge of pride, a vindication of survival. But the exhilaration masked a deeper, more dangerous question. What to do with the land and the people now, under Israeli control? The Arab states, at a summit in Khartoum, issued the infamous 3 no's. No peace, no recognition, no negotiations. Yet behind closed doors, a handful of Israeli leaders wondered if the captured territories might be bargaining chips for peace. Could land be exchanged for recognition? For a brief moment, hope flickered, but the tide of history was already shifting. Settlements began to appear in the West Bank. Driven by both strategic planners and religious nationalists, who saw biblical prophecy fulfilled. The occupation hardened into a daily reality, with checkpoints, military rule, and growing Palestinian resentment. Yom Kippur War 1973. A bitter surprise 6 years later, the price of victory would be exacted. On October 6, 1973, as Jews fasted and prayed on Yom Kippur, sirens shattered the stillness. Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated surprise attack, storming across the Suez Canal and the Golan Heights. The timing was cruelly brilliant. Israel's army was thinly spread, its guard lowered on the holiest day. At first, panic gripped the country. Radio broadcasts broke into prayers with urgent calls for reservists to report. Families abandoned synagogue pews for bomb shelters. On the front lines, Israeli soldiers were overwhelmed, retreating under heavy fire. In the Sinai, Egyptian infantry, armed with Soviet-made Sagar missiles, decimated Israeli tanks. On the Golan, Syrian armor poured down the plateau toward Galilee, threatening to breach into Israel proper. For days, Israel seemed on the brink. Defense Minister Dayan, once the hero of 1967, sank into despair, muttering of the destruction of the Third Temple, a metaphor for national catastrophe. Prime Minister Golda Meir under unimaginable pressure, chain-smoked and wrestled with pleas from her generals to consider nuclear readiness as a last resort. And yet, as in 1967, resilience turned the tide. Within a week, Israel mobilized 400,000 reservists. Fierce battles raged. In the Sinai, General Ariel Sharon, brash and unorthodox, led a daring maneuver to cross the Suez Canal, circling the Egyptian Third Army. In the north, Israeli forces pushed the Syrians back beyond the Golan Heights, within artillery range of Damascus. By the time a U.S.-brokered ceasefire took hold on October 25th, Israel had regained lost ground, but victory was Pyrrhic. Over 2,600 Israeli soldiers were dead, a staggering toll for a small nation. The myth of Israeli invincibility, born in 1967, lay in ruins. The war left scars not just on the battlefield, but on the psyche of a people who had believed themselves untouchable. The road to peace. Egypt and Israel, ironically, it was out of the ashes of the Yom Kippur War that peace began to grow. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, though defeated, had restored Arab honor. The sight of Egyptian troops crossing the Suez, even briefly, gave him political capital. Unlike Nasser before him, Sadat sought not endless confrontation but a way forward. In 1977, the world gasped as Sadat flew to Jerusalem, becoming the first Arab leader to set foot in Israel. Standing before the Knesset, he declared, "I come to you today on solid ground, so that we may build a durable peace." His courage stunned Israelis. Many wept, others doubted. Could the man whose armies had killed so many now be trusted as a partner? Prime Minister Menachem Begin, leader of the right-wing Likud party, was no dove, but he recognized opportunity. Under U.S. President Jimmy Carter's mediation at Camp David in 1978, Begin and Sadat forged a deal. Israel would withdraw from the Sinai in exchange for peace with Egypt. It was a bold gamble. For the first time, Israel would trade land for recognition. The treaty, signed in 1979, was a watershed. Egypt became the first Arab state to recognize Israel. Borders were drawn, ambassadors exchanged, and the guns along the Suez fell silent. Israelis celebrated, though uneasily. Some felt betrayed, giving up Sinai settlements and oil fields. Among Arabs, Sadat was vilified as a traitor. 2 years later, in 1981, he paid with his life, assassinated by extremists. Yet his legacy endures as the man who cracked open the door to peace. Peace with Jordan 1994. A quieter victory. The road to peace with Jordan was less dramatic, but equally profound. For decades, Israel and Jordan had waged shadow, war spying, skirmishing, occasional back-channel contacts. King Hussein of Jordan, elegant and cautious, had privately signaled his pragmatism, but the political winds of the Arab world restrained him. By the early 1990s, however, with the Cold War ending and the Middle East reshaped by the Gulf War, new possibilities emerged. In 1994, under U.S. sponsorship, Israel and Jordan signed a formal peace treaty. Unlike with Egypt, there was little land to exchange, just border demarcations, water-sharing agreements, and promises of cooperation. The signing ceremony on the desert border was a quieter affair than Camp David, but no less historic. Israelis could now cross into Ammon without fear. Jordanians could travel to Tel Aviv. Commerce, tourism, and intelligence cooperation followed. For Israel, peace with Jordan meant security on two of its longest frontiers. For King Hussein, it meant stability and American aid. Wars that reshaped the Middle East, the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, were more than military conflicts. They were tectonic shifts in Middle Eastern history. The former gave Israel strategic depth in Jerusalem, but saddled it with the Palestinian question. The latter humbled Israel, eroded its aura of invulnerability, and forced its leaders to consider diplomacy as survival, not luxury. Peace with Egypt and Jordan was groundbreaking, not only because it ended state-to-state wars, but because it signaled that even sworn enemies could recognize each other's legitimacy. These treaties, fragile and often cold, have nonetheless held for decades. They proved that, while ideology and hatred ran deep, pragmatism could prevail. And yet the story is unfinished. The Palestinians left outside both deals continued to live under occupation. The hope that peace with Egypt and Jordan might open a broader path to resolution never fully materialized. Instead, Israel found itself secure against its neighbors, but entangled in conflict within. From the lightning strike of the Six-Day War to the shattering ambush of Yom Kippur from the handshake at Camp David to the quiet signing on the Jordanian border, Israel's history in these decades was a pendulum swing between war and peace. The guns fell silent along some frontiers, but the echoes remained, reverberating through refugee camps, through settlements, through the stubborn soil of a land both promised and contested. The question that lingered was as old as the Bible itself. Could swords truly be beaten into plowshares in this land of prophets and battlefields? Or was each fragile peace merely an interlude before the next storm? Chapter 19. The Palestinian Conflict. History of Israel. The stones flew first. In December 1987, on the narrow streets of Gaza's Jabalia refugee camp, teenagers in ragged jeans and keffiyehs clutched rocks with trembling hands. They faced down Israeli soldiers in steel helmets, their rifles raised, their jeeps idling in clouds of dust. It was not the balance of armies, nor the clash of generals. It was the raw defiance of the powerless. Mothers wailed from balconies as boys darted through alleys, shouting slogans of liberation, while soldiers fired tear gas and rubber bullets. What began as an accident, a fatal collision between an Israeli truck and 4 Palestinian workers, ignited a fury decades in the making. The first intifada had begun. Across the land, from the olive groves of Nablus to the back streets of Jerusalem, the uprising spread like wildfire. The Palestinian Liberation Organization PLO, long exiled and waging politics from abroad, suddenly saw the people themselves, the shopkeepers. Students, laborers rise without waiting for instructions. Israelis, who had grown used to the occupation as a regrettable but manageable reality. The daily rhythm of ambushes, roadblocks, and funerals shattered any illusion of permanence. It was the beginning of a new chapter in a century-long conflict, one where the battlefield shifted from the deserts and borders of the Arab-Israeli wars to the very heart of daily life checkpoints refugee. Camps and negotiations across polished tables in Washington and Oslo, the PLO, from guerrillas to diplomats. The Palestine Liberation Organization, founded in 1964, had once been a byword for militancy. Yasser Arafat, the charismatic leader of Fatah, had transformed the PLO into a quasi-government in exile. Its fighters trained in Lebanon and Jordan, its envoys roamed world capitals, and its slogan, "Armed struggle is the path to liberation," echoed through the 1960s and 70s. To Israel and the West, the PLO was synonymous with terrorism, hijackings, bombings. Munich, 1972, but too many Palestinians. It was the only voice insisting their dispossession in 1948 was not forgotten. By the late 1980s, the PLO's fortunes had shifted. Expelled from Jordan during Black September in 1970, and later driven from Beirut during Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon, Arafat's movement was marooned in Tunis, geographically and politically distant from the lives of ordinary Palestinians under occupation. The first intifada caught them by surprise. Grassroots committees, student unions, and mosque networks coordinated strikes and demonstrations, often improvising in the moment. For once, the resistance was not orchestrated from afar, but born in the dusty courtyards of Gaza and the winding streets of the West Bank. Israel's response: deploying soldiers to quell demonstrations, imprisoning thousands, and demolishing homes only deepened Palestinian anger and drew international attention. Images of stone-throwing boys facing heavily armed troops became iconic, splashed across Western television screens. For the first time, the global narrative began to tilt. Palestinians were no longer seen only as hijackers in foreign airports, but also as a people struggling under military occupation. This was the moment the PLO saw its chance. Arafat, pragmatic beneath his revolutionary flair, understood that the gun alone would not deliver Palestine. Diplomacy, even compromise might. In 1988, in a dramatic speech in Algiers, the PLO declared its recognition of Israel's right to exist and accepted UN resolutions calling for a two-state solution. It was a gambler, partial surrender of maximalist dreams, but it opened the door to dialogue. Intifadas, fire and fury, the first intifada, lasted 6 long years. Its weapons were strikes, protests, and boycotts as much as stones and Molotov cocktails. Israel responded with what Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin called the force of might, power, and beatings. By the time it ebbed in the early 1990s, more than 1,000 Palestinians and some 160 Israelis were dead. But the uprising had changed the calculus. Israelis, weary of sending their sons to patrol hostile alleys, began questioning whether permanent occupation was sustainable. The 1991 Gulf War added a strange twist. Arafat had aligned with Saddam Hussein, hoping Iraq's missiles might shatter Israel and tilt the Arab world toward the Palestinian cause. Instead, it isolated him. Gulf states cut funding, and Palestinians in Kuwait suffered reprisals. Yet the war also realigned the Middle East, bringing the U.S. into a role of direct mediation. Washington saw an opportunity. If Arabs and Israelis could unite under American auspices, perhaps peace was possible. Thus came the Madrid Conference in 1991, the first time Israelis and Palestinians sat in the same forum. Progress was halting, but the ice was broken. Behind the scenes, however, far from Madrid's glare, something more daring was taking shape in a quiet Scandinavian capital: the Oslo Accords. Hope in the north? It began almost clandestinely in a villa outside Oslo, where Norwegian academics and diplomats hosted Israeli and Palestinian negotiators away from cameras and posturing. The participants were mid-level figures at first, Israeli academics linked to the government, PLO officials with Arafat's blessing. Over months, through endless nights of cigarettes, coffee, and arguments, they hammered out what had seemed unthinkable: mutual recognition. In September 1993, the world watched in astonishment as Yitzhak Rabin, the gruff Israeli general turned prime minister, shook Yasser Arafat's hand on the White House lawn. Between them stood President Bill Clinton, beaming like a proud parent. The Oslo Accords were unveiled. Israel would gradually withdraw from parts of the West Bank and Gaza, and a Palestinian Authority would be created to govern them. In return, Palestinians renounced violence and recognized Israel's right to exist. The mood was electric. Newspapers ran headlines of peace at last. Israeli peace activists danced in Tel Aviv squares. Palestinians cheered as the PLO returned from exile to establish offices in Gaza. Arafat, once derided as a terrorist, now donned a suit and delivered speeches in English to Western parliaments. Rabin, once the enforcer of occupation, now spoke of peace as a soldier's ultimate duty. And yet, beneath the euphoria, the seeds of disillusion were already being sown. The accords were vague, interim, and riddled with ambiguities. They left Jerusalem unresolved, ignored refugees' right of return, and allowed Israel to continue expanding settlements. For Palestinians, the peace often meant more checkpoints and fragmented enclaves. For Israelis, every suicide bombing launched by Hamas, which rejected Oslo outright, was proof that Arafat could not deliver security. Still, for a moment, the dream was real. In 1994, Rabin Arafat and Foreign Minister Shimon Peres shared the Nobel Peace Prize. But peace in the Middle East is always precarious, balanced on the edge of a knife. Collapse. from Rabin's murder to the Second Intifada, on November 4th, 1995, Rabin stood on a Tel Aviv stage at a peace rally, singing Shir LaShalom's song for peace with thousands of supporters. As he walked down the steps, a young Jewish extremist, Yigal Amir, pushed through the crowd and fired 2 bullets into his back. The prime minister crumpled. Within hours, Israel's best hope for reconciliation lay dead. The assassination was not just the death of a man, but a shattering of trust. Successive leaders, from Shimon Peres to Benjamin Netanyahu, struggled to sustain Oslo. Violence escalated, Palestinian militants launched waves of suicide bombings, Israeli forces retaliated with raids and closures. The fragile architecture of hope began to collapse. By 2000, when U.S. President Bill Clinton convened Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak at Camp David, the gulf was too wide. Barak offered significant concessions, withdrawal from most of the West Bank, shared control of Jerusalem, but Arafat balked. Unwilling to surrender on refugees and sovereignty, talks collapsed, each side blaming the other. That autumn, when Ariel Sharon, the hardline Israeli politician, marched defiantly onto Jerusalem's Temple Mount, with a phalanx of police, the spark lit the tinder. The Second Intifada erupted. Like the first, it was far more violent. Gun battles, suicide attacks in Tel Aviv, Israeli airstrikes and tanks rolling into West Bank cities. Over 5 bloody years, some 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis were killed. For Israelis, buses exploding in rush hour became the unbearable symbol of Oslo's failure. For Palestinians, the sight of tanks in Ramallah and Arafat besieged in his compound was proof that peace had been a mirage. Trust evaporated. Hatred deepened. Gaza, disengagement and division. By the mid-2000s, the stalemate forced new strategies. In 2005, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, once the champion of settlements, stunned his own Likud party by ordering a unilateral disengagement from Gaza. Israeli settlers were evacuated, often dragged crying from their homes. The army pulled out. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, Palestinians controlled a piece of land without Israeli troops inside. But jubilation quickly soured. In 2006, Hamas won Palestinian legislative elections, defeating Arafat's old Fatah movement. The world watched in disbelief as ballots, not bullets, delivered victory to an Islamist movement that openly called for Israel's destruction. Within a year, Hamas and Fatah were at war. Gunmen battled in Gaza streets. Corpses dangled from rooftops. When the dust settled, Hamas controlled Gaza, while Fatah retained the West Bank. The dream of Palestinian unity lay in ruins. Israel, citing Hamas rocket attacks, imposed a blockade on Gaza. The Strip became a cauldron. 2 million people packed into a sliver of land, hemmed in by barbed wire, sea patrols, and walls. Periodic wars erupted 2008, 2012, 2014. 2021 with missiles arching over the border and civilians on both sides huddling in fear. For Israelis in Sderot, air raid sirens became the soundtrack of life. For Gazan's drones buzzed overhead like an omnipresent threat. Recent tensions, an endless cycle in the years since. The Palestinian conflict has hardened into a grim routine of flare-ups and stalemates. Negotiations in Annapolis in 2007, Karis efforts in 2014 have come and gone. Settlements in the West Bank have expanded, carving the land into patchworks. Jerusalem, claimed by both peoples, has seen eruptions of violence around its sacred sites. For Palestinians, despair deepens. Sovereignty remains elusive, the economy strangled, politics paralyzed. For Israelis, security concerns justify a tightening grip. International mediators shuttle endlessly, but each side doubts the other's sincerity. Hamas's rockets, Israel's airstrikes, funerals, and speeches. The cycle repeats, wearying even its chroniclers. And yet, beneath the rubble and rhetoric, ordinary lives persist. In Ramallah, brim with students scrolling their phones. In Tel Aviv, children play on beaches as jets roar overhead. Both peoples dream of normality, yet history, heavy and unforgiving, binds them in a tragic embrace. The Palestinian conflict has endured, because it is not merely about land, but about identity, justice, and memory. For Palestinians, The Nakba of 1948, when hundreds of thousands were displaced, remains a wound never healed. For Israelis, the specter of annihilation, born of centuries of persecution and the Holocaust, shapes every security calculation. Oslo's failure revealed that without addressing these deeper narratives, maps and accords are fragile. The First Intifada revealed Palestinian agency, but also the limits of occupation. The Second Intifada revealed the depths of mistrust and the cost of violence. Gaza's disengagement revealed that withdrawal without trust leads not to peace, but to further conflict. Each chapter has taught lessons, yet none has brought closure. On the walls of Jerusalem's old city, one can stand at dusk and hear the muezziness call from Al-Aqsa Mosque, mingle with church bells and the hum of Hebrew prayers. It is a soundscape of coexistence and of collision. The Palestinian conflict remains unsolved, not because solutions are unknowable, but because fear, history, and mistrust weigh more heavily than hope. And yet, as the children of both peoples grow up under the shadow of walls and watchtowers, one cannot help but wonder, will they inherit only the bitterness of their parents? Or one day, against all odds, sing their own song for peace? Chapter 20, Israel in the 21st Century. History of Israel, a nation of paradox on a hot July morning in Tel Aviv. The Mediterranean air hummed with a mixture of salt, car exhaust, and the chatter of young Israelis clustered in cafes, laptops glowing under parasols. The Wi-Fi was free, the espresso strong, and the conversation spilled easily between Hebrew, English, and Russian. Just a few blocks away in discreet offices near Rothschild Boulevard, venture capitalists scanned pitches from 20-something entrepreneurs, dreamed not of carving kibbutz. Farms from rocky soil as their grandparents once did, but of building the next billion-dollar startup. Yet only an hour's drive south, in the dusty expanse near Gaza, Israeli soldiers stood alert behind concrete fortifications, eyes trained on the horizon, listening for the whine of rockets that could split the sky at any moment. The paradox of Israel in the 21st century was laid bare, a society at once deeply anxious and profoundly inventive, caught between perpetual security dilemmas and a dazzling spirit of creation that had earned it the nickname Startup Nation. This is the story of a country navigating its newest chapter, a tale of innovation and division, of diplomacy rewritten, and of conflicts both old and startlingly new. The main narrative, technology, and innovation. The 21st century dawned with Israel already boasting a remarkable reputation for technological ingenuity. But what unfolded in the following decades bordered on the astonishing. Israel, a nation of barely 10 million people, became a global laboratory of innovation. The roots of this transformation lay in a confluence of necessity and creativity. The pressing need for survival had always forced Israelis to innovate, whether in agriculture, defense, or communication. From the mid-2000s, Tel Aviv emerged as a hub second only to Silicon Valley in startups per capita. Walk down the streets of Herzliya Pichuak or Ra'anana, and you would find unassuming office blocks that housed companies. Pioneering everything from cyber defense systems to medical breakthroughs, it's the story of ways the navigation app created by Israeli developers and eventually sold to Google for over $1 billion became emblematic of the nation's entrepreneurial drive. A solution born from the frustration of sitting in traffic turned into a tool reshaping global mobility. Behind the glamour of acquisitions and IPOs, there was a deeper national narrative. Military service in elite units like Unit 8200 funneled thousands of tech-savvy young people into civilian life, armed with a unique skill set and intersection of coding, improvisation, and strategic problem-solving. For many Western visitors, it was startling to realize that the young woman pouring their cappuccino in the morning might be the same one. A year earlier had been monitoring cyber threats for the army, deciphering encrypted signals, or even hacking into hostile networks. Israel's agricultural technologies, once focused on survival farming, expanded to global impact. From drip irrigation systems that could turn arid fields in Africa fertile to water desalination plants along its own, Mediterranean coast that rendered Israel water self-sufficient. The country recast itself as a pioneer in sustainable solutions for a warming planet. The desert, once an enemy, was being conquered with mathematics and ingenuity. Social and cultural diversity, a mosaic of identities, Yet beneath this triumphal narrative lay the messy, intricate reality of Israel's social fabric. 21st century Israel was not a homogeneous startup nation, but a kaleidoscope of communities, sometimes harmonious, sometimes fractious. Jewish Israelis themselves were far from uniform. The grandchildren of Ashkenazi immigrants from Poland and Germany mingled uneasily with Mizrahi Jews whose parents had fled Baghdad, Damascus, and Casablanca in the mid-20th century. Waves of immigration in the 1990s from the crumbling Soviet Union reshaped entire neighborhoods, bringing with them Russian newspapers, Orthodox churches for those who had converted, and a distinct cultural assertiveness. Meanwhile, Ethiopian Jews rescued in dramatic airlifts in the 1980s and 1990s struggled for equality, their dark skin marking them as both proudly Jewish and painfully marginalized. Then there were the Arab citizens of Israel, roughly 20% of the population. They lived in towns like Al-Fam and Nazareth, carried Israeli passports, voted in elections, and sent their children to Hebrew-speaking universities. Yet many also bore the legacy of 1948 as a wound, descendants of families who had not fled but now lived as a minority in a Jewish state. Their place in Israeli society was contested, suspended between civic participation and cultural alienation. The fault lines of diversity ran deeper in religion. In secular Tel Aviv, same-sex couples walked hand in hand along Rothschild Boulevard. Startups offered vegan menus, and Friday night was a time not for Sabbath prayers, but for bars and beaches. In Jerusalem's Mishiarim, however, ultra-Orthodox Haredim crowded narrow alleys. Wrapped in black coats, clinging fiercely to traditions, often resisting conscription or the encroachment of modernity. Between these worlds, political battles erupted over education, army service, and marriage laws fault lines that would define Israel's internal debates as much as its external wars. Regional diplomacy and the Abraham Accords. Diplomacy in the 21st century began in the familiar pattern. Israel surrounded by suspicion and hostility. But then, in 2020, the world witnessed a seismic shift that seemed at first almost inconceivable. The Abraham Accords, brokered by the United States, brought Israel into open diplomatic relations with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and later Sudan. The images were extraordinary. Israeli businessmen stepping off planes in Abu Dhabi, kosher food served in Dubai hotels, and direct flights from Tel Aviv to Manama. For many Israelis, it felt like the long-awaited peace dividend that Oslo had promised, but never fully delivered. Unlike Egypt and Jordan, whose treaties with Israel had been cold and pragmatic, the Gulf nations seemed eager to embrace Israel not just politically, but commercially and technologically. The motivations were complex. For the UAE and Bahrain, aligning with Israel meant accessing its technology and defense industries, but it also signaled a united front against Iran, the shadow looming over the Gulf as much as Israel.
Ow!
For Israel, it was validation, a reminder that it could transcend the paralysis of the Palestinian stalemate and still forge peace. The name Abraham was not accidentally gestured toward the shared patriarch of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, a symbolic bridge across centuries of division. And yet the Accords did not erase the Palestinian question. Critics argued that Arab regimes had abandoned the cause of Palestinian statehood, normalizing relations with Israel without demanding concessions on settlements or occupation. For Palestinians, watching Israel embrace Dubai while their own checkpoints remained, it was a bitter reminder of their exclusion. Still, the Accords marked a rare moment in which Israel's regional integration seemed not only possible, but unfolding before the world's eyes. Security challenges and modern geopolitics, yet peace in Abu Dhabi did not translate into peace in Gaza or southern Lebanon. Israel's security dilemmas remained relentless, reshaped but never vanquished. The second intifada of the early 2000s had already scarred. Israeli society with suicide bombings in Jerusalem cafes and buses. By the mid-2000s, Hamas's takeover of Gaza ensured that rocket fire into southern Israel became a recurring terror. Towns like Sderot lived under the constant wail of sirens, where parents had 15 seconds to rush children into bomb shelters. To the north, Hezbollah entrenched itself in Lebanon, amassing rockets supplied by Iran. The 2006 Lebanon War was a grim foretaste of future conflicts. Israeli towns pounded, Lebanese civilians caught in the crossfire, and neither side emerging victorious. Cybersecurity emerged as the new frontier. Israeli intelligence services warned that the next war might not only involve rockets, but attacks on banks, water systems, or airports through keystrokes rather than bombs. Israel responded by investing heavily in cyber defense, launching some of the most sophisticated operations in modern espionages, some of which reportedly targeted Iran's nuclear facilities. Iran itself remained the central obsession. Its pursuit of nuclear technology became the focal point of Israel's strategic calculus. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, addressing the United Nations in 2012, famously held up a cartoon bomb diagram warning of Iran's nuclear red line. Too many Israelis, Iran's ambitions were existential in a way no other threat was. A state whose leaders openly vowed to erase Israel, now flirting with nuclear weapons. Israel also faced the paradox of being a military power whose economy relied on open borders and trade. The more it integrated into global commerce, exporting software, medical devices, defense systems, the more it had to defend against boycotts, sanctions, and diplomatic isolation. Security in the 21st century was not just about tanks and rockets, but about narrative legitimacy in the struggle over public opinion in universities, its parliaments, and media screens worldwide. The story of Israel in the 21st century is not just one of survival or innovation, but of contradictions that demand to be held together in tension. On one hand, Israel became indispensable in global technology, earning admiration from Silicon Valley and venture capitalists. On the other, it faced deep criticism for its occupation of Palestinian territories, sparking protests from London to San Francisco. Its social diversity was both a strength and a strain, fueling creativity through cultural fusion while igniting political battles between secular and religious, Jewish and Arab, immigrant and veteran. The Abraham Accords revealed that the Middle East's map was not frozen in the animosities of 1948. That Arab states could reimagine alliances based on pragmatism and shared threats. Yet they also underlined a haunting truth. Peace with states was achievable, but peace with peoples remained elusive. Security challenges evolved from guerrilla wars to rocket barrages to cyber threats, each demanding new strategies, each pulling Israel deeper into the paradox of being at once hyper-vulnerable and hyper-armed. In the 21st century, Israel stood as a country suspended between triumph and turmoil. Its entrepreneurs reshaped the digital world. Its farmers turned deserts green. Its diplomats rewrote regional alliances. Yet the echoes of conflict never receded. The dream of coexistence remained fragile. And the nation's soul wrestled with what it meant to be both a Jewish state and a democracy in a fractured land. Perhaps the most enduring image of modern Israel is not the missile defense system intercepting rockets, or the skyscrapers of Tel Aviv's tech district, nor the signing ceremonies of the Abraham Accords, but rather the sight of a young Israeli coding in a cafe with headphones on, while a soldier nearby keeps watch with rifle in hand. One builds, the other defends. Together, they embody the essence of Israel in the 21st century, a country forever on guard, forever creating, forever searching for peace that remains just beyond reach.